Welcome everybody, and it's great to see all of you in this room and online, of course. I'm particularly happy about this event, not because it's about a murder. It's not because Professor Steve Gallagher will finally reveal the secret about who actually did it, who was Jack the Ripper. It's because I'm happy because this is, in a way, a joint enterprise. We have with us Professor Gallagher, of course, who's the mastermind behind this, and Professor Ian Morley from our history department at CUHK. We also have Ms. Yasmine Zahir, a CUHK Law graduate and practicing barrister, and joining from the UK, from London, Mr. Jeremy Dein QC, one of the top barristers in London. So it's great to have so much expertise in this room and to hear about something about a mystery case which has made so many people think about what happened and what didn't happen. And as I said, today we will hear the truth. Again, welcome to everybody, and I hope we'll have a great seminar. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Dean Wolf. So just to set the scene of how things are going to run today, first, welcome to everyone. Then the first hour or so will be Professor Ian Morley and I talking about the Jack the Ripper murders and really what London was like, the whole context of the murders and why they became worldwide known about and everyone was so interested in them. Then we'll have a short break because we have got people in the room as well to allow a little bit of a comfort break for people if they need it. And then Yasmine Zahir, a local barrister and a CUHK Law alumna, will be talking about Hong Kong serial killers. So we'll hear some of the gruesome facts to do with those serial killings as well. And then again, a short break, and then we'll have Jeremy talking from London, where he'll be talking hopefully a bit about how you would defend some of these characters and some of maybe the evidential and procedural issues that go about in the prosecutions and in defending people who are accused of these sorts of crimes. So to start, we have from the history department, Professor Ian Morley, and Ian is an associate professor of urban history at CUHK and is research really focused upon built fabric, particularly in the Philippines during the American colonial era. Earlier, Ian was saying to me, he's an urban historian, and that involves a great interest in the way that cities develop and the law and the history of cities as well. So Ian's going to talk to us about London in the 1880s, that sort of context for the Jack the Ripper killings. So over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to Dean Wolf for the introduction. Thank you, Stephen, as well. I've got to share my screen. Okay, again, thank you. Thank you very much for people being here, both in person and online. Again, just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Ian Morley. I formerly was known as a British historian when I first came to CUHK, but I've moved away from that now. But in a sense, I'm still dealing with developing society, and changing cities. But more specifically, as Professor Gallagher said, to do with the Philippines. Now, what I want to do today is provide a lot of context, in a sense. I'm not going to specifically talk about Jack the Ripper and details about the series of crimes in Whitechapel, but I want to provide context, particularly with regards to perceptions, morality, and how the Victorians viewed their society. Because I think it's very easy to misunderstand the nuances of the age. And in doing so, it's very easy to misread what Jack the Ripper, so to speak, or the crimes in 1888 in Whitechapel, London, represented. And really, if we're thinking about criminal events in Whitechapel from specifically August to November of 1888, they comprise much more than a murder mystery. The crimes that took place then and since have shaped both the public and professional imagination. For instance, at the time of the events in 1888, October specifically, W.T. Stead of the Pall Mall Gazette wrote that there's only one topic that people were speaking about in England, and that was the Whitechapel murders of, in inverted commas, Jack the Ripper. And likewise, again, I mentioned about public imagination. If you simply go onto Google, as I found, apparently you can get 55.2 million web listings within half a second or so. So clearly there's a lot of information and likewise misinformation as to who Jack was and what actually happened. No one is even sure how many murders were actually committed. But I do think that when we come to terms with the crimes of Jack the Ripper, it's critical to not underestimate a range of historical, social, cultural, creative, and media representations. And of course, what's so unique about Jack the Ripper is its place in popular culture. And I suppose one way that you know you've made it in popular culture is when Hollywood starts throwing tens of millions of dollars and have pretty boy and pretty girl actors starring in films about you. And as I've said, really, the quotation on the screen, I think, is quite interesting. This was taken from the film. But I think really the inspiration is more likely behind the giving birth of overacting. And as I said, bad filmmaking, more specifically with regards to From Hell. One that largely can distort the facts for the purpose of entertainment, more specifically for the pursuit of financial gain. This was a film that was reviewed in the Guardian newspaper at the time, somewhat about 20 years ago, as, quote, a history fail, given that the entire storyline is about a hoax. And of course, it's about Inspector Aberline, for instance. He dies of a heroin overdose, an opium overdose. But we know in real life, he actually retired in old age in Bournemouth, which is a seaside town in England, which is about as far removed from the poverty, slums, and problems of East London that you can probably imagine. Now, again, I want to just talk about people with regards to media, the influence of people like W.T. Stead, who had largely ignored in popular culture. Stead was a major name in the realm of Victorian journalism towards the end of the 19th century. In a sense, his name is associated with the development and practice of what we might call investigative journalism. His work in particular inspired Moral Panics. He was a writer most well known for his articles, The Maiden Tribute, which was about child prostitution. And as a consequence of his writing and other actions, he ended up getting himself thrown in prison. But one of the effects of this was it also had the effect of altering the law, and in so doing, raising the age of consent. But again, what is important about Stead is it gives us an example of how government by journalism can occur, where journalism can evolve in nature to a form where it's not only afraid to create a news event, rather than merely just reporting upon matters in society so as to shape public policy. And again, I think this is really, really important because one of the effects of Stead was it gave rise, at least in continental Europe, French-speaking Europe, that there was a view that roaming around English society were sadistic gentlemen. These individuals were symbolized by the shadowy moniker of the Minotaur of London. And in a sense, these were individuals who were roaming around society seeking human sacrifice for their own pleasure. And I think Jack the Ripper needs to be, again, fed into this particular context. Now, I'm really going to go back in time, and I'm really going to broaden out with regards to how we come to understand what happened in Whitechapel in 1888. And again, I'm going to start as broadly as possible. We need to realize about the fast changes, particularly urban growth changes that occurred from the late 1700s onwards in British society. And by the early 1800s, the rise of what was known as the paradox of progress. On the one hand, industrialization and urban growth had inspired a forward movement in British civilization. In other words, it was a golden age of British social development. The ancient Greeks had had it, the Romans had had it, the Florentines had had it, the British now believed it was their turn to have it. But at the same time, the city was perceived as a source of danger. This danger was both physical in the form of disease or crime, but likewise, it was also perceived danger. So the viewpoint is born, basically, that this new society has come into existence, and it is one that is saturated with problems. And it's through such a standpoint that class stereotypes emerged. In other words, stereotypes about rich and poor, honest and respectable, and likewise the immoral and reckless. I think, again, this anxiety, we need to realize, was actually heightened by a series of investigations that took place from the 1830s and 1840s by people such as Thomas Malthus, Henry Mayhew, Edwin Chadwick. They all exacerbated the perceived danger. And in a sense, it established an image that society was in a poor pathological state, a depiction of a new society, one established under industrial conditions, but as I previously mentioned, one riddled with severe social problems. And again, it's through this lens that class stereotypes emerged, one being that of the irredeemable working class. Now, again, it's important when we think about crime and criminality to understand how people in the 19th century in Britain understood how crime was created. The common belief was that crime was created by bad habits. This argument attained great sway in the context of moral codes that emerged from the early Victorian, the 1830s and 1840s onwards. And again, the problems of society, it was believed, were fundamentally created by the poor's lack of moral training. And this became a subject of debate and practical action amongst social reformers and politicians. And in a sense, it was kind of typified by this rise of the notion of what was a rough. The rough you can see on the screen, but this in a sense is a member of an uncivilized race that exists within civilized society. And these roughs were persons who by and large would commit offenses against the person, such as robbery, which for an example represented one of the most horrifying criminal activities of the 19th century. Incidents of robbery alongside murder would send ripples of fear through fast-growing urban communities, but not just within cities, but within the nation as a whole at times. There are examples of this in relation to, for instance, the garottings, the strangulations that occurred in London in the 1850s and 1860s, and likewise the Whitechapel murders of 1888. They stand out as amongst the most shocking crimes to the Victorians. And again, what is important here is the apparently seemingly indiscriminate violence that these events represented. And that created, as I've said, deep-rooted, deep-seated anxiety within urban communities. Now, again, what's very, very important to understand about the Victorians is not only their different labeling of people, but likewise the different stratas that were believed to exist within the laboring population. That is to say, those that will work, those that cannot work, those that will not work, those that need not work. And in a sense, the Victorian belief with regards to morals were that decisions in life would lead to different pathways. And of course, one of the pathways being criminality. But again, what did criminality mean? The Victorians, in a sense, established a precise meaning of the word criminal and the kind of person that it entailed. It was not only a visible definition, it was a psychological definition as well. And I'm just going to reference J.B. Tobias's book, Crime and Industrial Society in the 19th Century, where he talks about criminals being viewed, believed to be a class which lived on its own, separate from the rest of society. Criminals were a savage poor, in other words, not only distinguishable by their habits, but by their appearance, their clothing, their anatomy, their speech. And again, they were understood to live wholly or largely on the proceeds of crime. And most kind of fearful for the Victorians was this idea that crime was real. It was a real threat. And this was influential in forging emotions of insecurity within urban society. But again, when we come to the facts, there's a slightly different picture. Between 50 and 75% of all crimes each year were basically small-scale theft. The vast majority of offenders, 3 out of 4 or so, were men, and they were mostly young, in their teens or early 20s. And again, very, very important in trying to understand why crime was caused was the rise of science, particularly the science of phrenology, towards the end of the 19th century, second half of the 19th century. And this was born out of the idea that people's moral and intellectual faculties were identifiable through the shape of people's heads. So in other words, head shape influenced the brain and therefore behavior. And as again, just to contextually emphasize matters in broad sense, the Victorians increasingly located the tendency to criminality in the body and came to recognize that if evolution of society could go forward, then it could go backwards. Criminals as such became a throwback to a more savage age, and crime itself was seen as a social disease. And again, evidence for this, allegedly, was the rise of crime, the rise of vice, and this supplied, again, allegedly proof of degeneracy that was occurring within British society. Such phenomenon, it was believed, arose from the growing numbers of the urban population that lacked moral values and knowledge of what was right and wrong. Unfounded social, scientific, and cultural assumptions arising from alleged interconnection between character, class, hard work, and economic success led to people being distinguished in accord with notions of social respectability. It's possible to have a drink, please. And again, the assumptions of bourgeois Victorians led to certain types of people being viewed as lawless, indecent, immodest. And these degenerates, the habitual criminals, were believed to pose the most severe threat to social stability. Crimes, madness, acts of vice were symbols the middle class understood as symbols of degeneracy. And once again, these were peoples that lacked moral values or any kind of understanding as to what was right and to what was wrong. Because again, the notion of fear was very profound in the 19th century. The Victorians held many fears, and this often influenced their attitude to crime, to punishment, and to crime prevention. In 19th century Britain, social observers were convinced that crime was increasingly as a changing set of social conditions. And the perception, again, amongst those of property ownership, was that the working class were rejecting traditional community values. Evidence for this was in alcohol consumption, the lack of attendance at church, and again, immoral behaviors, including prostitution, which had encouraged an increasingly large proportion of the working classes to abandon themselves, potentially to a life of crime. Concerns about the apparent increase in crime and the rise of a permanent criminal class known as habitual criminals were expressed by members of the parliament and, importantly, in the media. Influential members of society used the media as a tool to propagate social values. In so doing, to stamp on and to stamp out social concerns. In other words, there's the use of the printed media as part of a social control canvas. And in this regard, letters sent by people to newspapers fueled anxiety about social safety and the risk of walking the streets, particularly at night. The Times newspaper of London, the Times of London, was a magnet for such letter writing, particularly from the 1850s onwards. Nervousness was perpetuated as a result of letters being printed and was heightened by newspapers reporting of crime. The sensationalizing or the misappropriating of incidents arose. Criminal incidents, of course, were not new. Matters such as garroting, which was a form of strangulation, had occurred long before the 1850s. But in the cultural and media climate of the 1850s, and a member of parliament actually being a victim of crime, this provided fuel for spectacular and terrifying imagery as to what Victorian life was like. In a society experiencing dramatic economic and urban transition, crime became a metaphor for a loss of social control and social disorder. Criminals, in a sense, symbolized evils that threatened the very fabric of society. The presence of criminality not only marked, but served to reinforce the gulf between respectability and disrepute. Crime, immorality, disorder, all attributable to a residuum of the dishonest poor, was attributable to a dishonest poor who congregated in certain quarters of cities. And again, habitual criminals in particular stood out as questionable evidence, in inverted commas, that criminal justice quite simply wasn't working, and that society was nurturing an entire class of debased people who had taken up crime as a profession. I think, again, in order to understand this, we need to realize, again, context. This massive issue was propagated in the media after the ending of transportation of criminals by the 1850s and 1860s. And again, in order to grasp just how the Victorians perceived and understood criminality, we've got to pay particular attention to the assumptions that people held with regards to those undertaking criminal acts. And I think there's 2 points. Firstly, although in reality, criminals engaged in a variety of activities, there was basically no differences to distinguish between the types of offenders in the 19th century. And secondly, repeat offenders explicitly demonstrated the existence of the perceived spiral of degeneration, i.e. the drunk can become a petty thief who then becomes a robber and then in turn becomes a murderer. And this was a particularly pertinent way of thinking with regards to juvenile offenders. The Cornhill magazine, which you can see on your screen, in a sense highlights how upon entering the working class district, a respectable person can be struck by the inhabitants' strange clothes and bodies. People are portrayed as weak, thin, malnourished. And again, this was true. This was a reality of the appearance of the poor, in part because of poor nutrition, long working days and hard physical work, and the unchecked presence of disease. Nevertheless, what we need to do is deal with reality. Victorian Britain was not overrun with criminals. And again, statistics for crime do not support the view that a dangerous class existed. Habitual criminals never numbered more than about 4,000 per year until the 1870s. Now, again, what I want to do now is to move forward and give you evidence of three different types of crimes, three different types of evidence, in a sense, as to how the Victorian perception affected, or how the media could affect Victorian perceptions of crime. And again, what I want to do is expose awareness of arsenic poisoning, burglary, and petty criminality through what was known as a comic known as the Penny Dreadful. And again, reporting of murders, particularly from the 1850s, had great prominence within a number of newspapers, particularly newspapers like The Crime. Many column inches were given. They often focused on the victims of crime, the nature of crime, and the place of crime. But in reality, violent crime was rare. And again, from the 1850s, the general pattern of crime was rather in decline rather than increase. Media attention, particularly on crimes with a sexual edge, nonetheless greatly helped encourage a climate of fear about the indiscriminate nature of crimes occurrences. And again, the anxiety of crime was most obvious to see through the notion of arsenic poisonings. Anxiety about arsenic poisonings was again propagated by the printed press. The dreadful reputation of arsenic guaranteed a public overreaction, even though in reality, poisoning crimes didn't substantially increase. But nonetheless, newspaper publishers recognized opportunity when they saw it to discuss it. Fear far outweighed the actual volume of poisonings being committed. And for instance, by the 1840s, there was only 98 trials for criminal poisoning. Yet the Times saw these cases as isolated examples of what they call countless undetected crimes. But just as today, my point is that people were drawn towards salacious stories of sex and violence. Lurid accounts of murder made compelling reading, and it made newspapers sell. And again, this is particularly important by 1855, when tax on newspapers were abolished. And in consequence of this law being passed, a host of new publications appear and competition for readership increased. So in a sense, the marketplace is becoming saturated with printed media. Everybody is vying for people to buy them. Now, with regards again to burglary, the symbolic and literal act of breaking glass represented a shattering of the barrier between respectable and non-respectable society. Burglary, akin to something like robbery, was considered both violent and traumatic in the Victorian mind. The mental impact of the crime was deep, and arguably the psychological impact was far greater than the physical damage it ever created. And in the middle-class mind, a person who undertook such an act as burglary or robbery quite simply had to belong to a different social class. They had to be cut from a different and moral cloth, one that was not shared by respectable society. Again, why was something like burglary so traumatic? Well, it was not just about the invasion of private space or the ransacking of the private domain. It was about the violation of a fundamental Victorian principle with regards to property ownership. It was about stealing and then selling goods for a profit. In other words, crime was a means by which people could make a livelihood. And breaking a window to enter a property constituted an ideological affront in which the property or the window was paid for by honest labor, but was broken wantonly. And again, in breaking the window, the criminal was shattering the inhabitants' domestic culture of looking at life from within the home. And again, it's insisting that other cultures exist on the other side of the window. Again, just to kind of reiterate further with regards to this notion of fear, we need to recognize that pre-industrial revolution, life was considered to be much more safe. And the Victorians looked at the past as a time of safety and greater morality than the time in which they lived. What was once a green and pleasant land they saw had been transformed into a place as a result of industrialization, lined with satanic mills and filthy cities with no-go areas. Criminal events in the Victorian age compared with an image of what Britain once was. In other words, society was now not safe, whereas once it had been. I think, again, what's very important is we need to understand that if society was believed to be unsafe and unruly, then how were government institutions and instruments to be established? Through regulation, through stronger penalties, the need to teach good morals, and of course to use education. But how was such an agenda to be immediately brought into being? Of course, like today, find decay and basically sensationalize it through the media. And again, media attention, especially on crimes with a sexual edge, nonetheless encouraged a climate of fear, again, about the indiscriminate nature of disease. Whereas in comparison, there was far greater incidences of domestic violence, and domestic violence was a massive problem in the 19th century. But again, this understanding of the type of violence is very important because it gives us an understanding of culture, understanding of class and the use of law, where there are two kinds of violence, excuse me. Firstly, there's the antisocial violence of the habitual criminal. This had to be crushed at all costs. And it was a type of behavior, again, that was believed to only come from a tiny minority of persons, whereas in contrast, the violence of everyday people was much more frequent in occurrence, yet was pardonable as long as it remained within certain cultural boundaries. So I want to just again move on and then talk about penny dreadfuls, because time will be short. Penny dreadfuls, in a sense, were a cheap comic, and these became perceived as glamorizing crime and making crime seem attractive, particularly to children. It was believed that they would lead them to a life of theft and ultimately onto murder. But again, Springhall's book, Youth, Popular Culture and Moral Panics, quote, says, middle-class observers came to exaggerate or distort the nature of popular reading so as to nurture due chagrin at the disappointingly escapist fruits of a working-class literacy that they had helped to nourish. I think, again, what's important here is the panic, the moral panic is about a cause and effect argument. Popular fiction, it was claimed, had the power to corrupt, so needed to be controlled through, coincidentally, a panic occurring at a time when cheap entertainment for the proletariat was on a rise. Criticism of penny dreadfuls, constructed by journalists and equated with the existence of juvenile crime, centered upon corruptible codes hidden inside cheap publications. And I think, again, what's a very important point in, the reality. The reality was it's about a cheap fiction. It's about a fantasy escape for young people who were largely seeking to avoid the realities of everyday life. And again, what were the realities of everyday life? That, in a sense, brings me through to understanding about Whitechapel. Whitechapel was a place of enormous poverty. I'm just going to quickly move on here. Not necessarily the greatest poverty that you would find in London or other cities, but it's again about the association of what Whitechapel as a place was. And again, that notion of poverty and overcrowding, because overcrowding was viewed by the middle class in the context of city problem association, a problem association of immorality, disorder, and even political discontent. Whitechapel was a place of thieves, in other words. It was a blacklisted part of the city with its slums, known for immorality, known for vice, known for disease. In other words, it epitomated all that outcast London, all that outcast society was about. But in reality, it's a place of low wages. It's a place of high rents for those who are poor. It's a place of temporary employment. It's about people struggling to survive. And again, one of the issues of survival was that the poor paid proportionately more per square foot of rented floor space. Wages and the ability to draw a salary at that time put, again, enormous pressure on the affordability of accommodation, particularly when it was known in 19th century cities like London, like Liverpool, like Manchester, where up to 25% of male workers would have an interruption to their salary during the year. Likewise, a similar percentage for women, about 20%. So in a sense, workers are given no choice but to stay in accommodation that was affordable, the lowest level of rents, worst level of accommodation standards. And again, this was simply about the need to live near sources of employment, where employment contracts would often be on a weekly or sometimes even a monthly level, on a very short-term level. And of course, to go back to Whitechapel, what does Whitechapel represent? It represents the place, the site of the shop crime of the Victorian era. Because between, again, August and November 1888, where a number of prostitutes were murdered, but I'd use the word prostitute loosely. Casual prostitutes is more apt, I think. And again, it's about not just a frequency, but a nature of attacks and the terror of what those attacks represented in the popular imagination or the shadowy imagination of Victorian Britain. Crimes of growing violence, seemingly bloodlust. And again, this was a place in London where the middle class were not concerned for the material problems of how people lived. They were just had a care for the material symptoms that were spawned as a result of those problems. So again, Whitechapel was just simply represented as a place of immorality, a place ultimately that was shaming the capital city. And I should say, shaming the capital city of the civilized world. And of course, the horror of Whitechapel was a violent series of crimes that had never been seen before. so serious and ongoing that it was difficult then, and sometimes difficult for us now to really get to terms with, to understand. Of course, at the time, it threw out a number of questions as to what was going on in British society, particularly questions of governability of the British Empire and the governability of London, because there was a fear that society was, in a sense, imploding under its own weight due to the loss of morality. And in consequence, society was now capable of producing individuals in hell, so to speak. It woke up Britain to the realities, more specifically the hardships of life for working class people, a matter that a reality that shocked what was largely an ignorant middle class society due to its social and economic fragmentation that was evident across urban space. In other words, London had a rich West End, but a very poor East End. And again, this was what we can see in the social maps of Charles Booth. I'll talk about Charles Booth in a moment. And again, Booth's maps showed that, in a sense, London was two cities in one. One of the affluent classes in the West, the other for the less well-off in the East, each not knowing each other, places of contrasting cultures, lifestyles, housing districts, life expectancies, realities. In a sense, the Ripper shocked society because it brutally exposed what urban living was like in East London. Again, it exposed the underlying problem of poverty, which had forced women into casual prostitution. And of course, we need to recognize the proximity of Whitehall to the center of London. This was violent crimes occurring within walking distance of Trafalgar Square, it being the premier space of the city, of the country, and so to speak, of the empire. And I think, again, for those of you interested in understanding about cities and space and distance, it's worthwhile going to the Charles Booth maps at the London School of Economics, where you can not only see a map of London, but it's actually a social portrait of the city. And it's a very, very interesting document so as to open up, again, a different vision of what life was like at the time. And again, we need to recognize the sense of the violence of the murders. In a sense, it's hard to understand now, somewhat funny in a way, but the crimes were believed to be too brutal to be done by someone who was English. This brought about a question of the other and just what culture they had. You can see on the picture the idea that it was maybe Irish or someone who was Jewish. But it was too brutal. It was, beyond the gentlemanly nature of what British people could be, as degenerate as they might be at times. And as I've said, this was about a place that was the epitome of outcast London, where day-to-day life was about low wages, trying to find whatever way to get by, but again, dealing with that context of proportionately high rents in relation to wage levels. Ultimately, Whitechapel was the ultimate place where a world was lived in relation, in proximity to immorality, and the exposing of this shamed London as the city of allegedly the most civilized society in the world. Of course, there is much to do with the exposure of the crimes, the reporting of the crimes. I won't go into this because it will be discussed in much more detail in a moment. But I do want to say that, again, in popular kind of thinking, and again, there's people that will give much more detail about this, it's the idea that the crimes were committed because of the police inability, their incompetence, the inability of the police to understand the motives, hence they're unsolved. And this is why there's 55 million websites on Google, because everyone can put forward a theory based on some kind of evidence, be it true or not. And again, even then, maybe even now, for some people, there's no strong reality as to understanding who the perpetrator was. But likewise, it's very easy to label the police and to criticize them in this setting. I think, again, coming back to the repeal of printed tax laws, this gave rise to an enormous volume of cheap publications that sought to sell and use the Ripper crimes as vast opportunity, in a sense. So these cheap publications, for instance, started to use color. This gives, interestingly, much more visual reference to blood. Blood becomes much, when put red rather than in black and white, it gives it a much more visually prominent space on the front page of the newspaper. And again, the media enforces that notion of social breakdown in the sense that social problems, if not appropriately managed, can and do lead to anarchy. And again, the bottom line is criminal events are basically being used to sell newspapers. And as I said, likewise, there was a massive growth in newspaper circulation in the second half of the 19th century, which proves just as today that sensationalism does sell. Of course, sensationalism can be used for the agenda of social reformists. The nature of the murders, the lives of the victims forcibly drew attention to their poor living conditions and the impact of life under poverty. Again, this reinforced the attention of social reformers to draw greater attention to the middle class broadly as to the plight of the poor and the challenges experienced on a day-to-day basis. But to come back to that issue of governability, questions were raised. How can you manage an empire if you can't even manage the East End in the nation's capital? And of course, this again needs to be understood through the realm of time. Ripperist murders are taking place in an age where there is the second industrial revolution. There's the rise of America as an industrial power and the rise of Germany. Their rise gave manifest the opinion that there was a decline in Britain that was taking place. British people were seen to be much thinner. The Germans in particular were not just much stronger, but happier and healthier. In other words, Britain, through its industrial path and its urban culture, had bred a race of weaklings that were much stronger to the Aryans of Germany. Again, this is questioning, proving into some evidence of Britain's decline of world significance. And as I said, it's through this line of thought that questions of the future of the empire are raised, not just as questions as to what Britain had become. And I think, again, what's important here is to understand how, through time, the application of things such as slum clearing becomes used. And the idea that law can be introduced to deal with areas that are considered the black spots, remove those black spots of degeneration, remove those people, not just remove the filth, remove the physicality of the slums, but you can redevelop, street widen, provide new buildings, and in a sense, socially re-engineer society to a higher level than what had previously existed. And that's what you find in the Kingsway Aldrich program in the 1890s. Slum clearing changes the face, the people, in other words, the culture of the city by removing the black spots and all that they physically and culturally entail. And in so doing, making London become a more imperial city, or the face of an imperial city as to what people believed it should be, centered upon the model of 19th century Paris and its changes. So to conclude, I think, again, it's really important when we come to think about the Ripper as 3 M's, both middle-class agenda and middle-class morality, and then the use of the media. Likewise, to understand what shock is. Shock took a number of different forms in 19th century Britain. It took the form of the impact of particular diseases, namely cholera, but also it took as well impact in terms of particular crimes, one being Jack the Ripper. And again, it reinforced the perception that large-sized urban places were actually places of danger. Although when we come in again into the statistics, the perception versus the reality and the threat of the perception are very, very different things. But again, what is important is how people were labeled, both people and places, labeled by a middle class. And again, that was propagated through media use. And ultimately, again, why? Because it's about the process of seeking to regulate society and again, regulate that evolution along a particular political social path. So thank you very much for your time and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. And while I'm just trying to load up my slides, I should just say that the Dean said that this was my idea. I should explain that actually this all comes about because of, let's see if I can find my slides. Yeah, there. So hopefully they're sharing now with you. This comes about because of a lunch I think Ian and I had, and we started to discuss this, and Ian started to explain to me a lot more about the history and everything about society, and particularly London at that time when the crimes occurred. So my role now is quite straightforward, is just to explain to you a little bit about the murders themselves. But we have to start with already a bit of an issue to do with the murders, in that, as has been said, there's actually a dispute about how many of these murders could be linked to the character who's been called Jack the Ripper. So here we have a map, which is from one of the Police Illustrated Gazettes that Ian kindly brought in, the original copies we've got here in the room with us today, which are over on the table over there. And that map is talking about the 7th of the undiscovered, or what we would say today, unsolved murders. Today, it's said that there are 5 murders in the canonical idea, even though I know, I think Paul Mitchell wants to dispute this with me at one point. But by the way, if anyone does have any questions, please remember you can chat questions into us, and we'll try and leave some time for this. But this is a map of the Whitechapel area going into the City of London, which has numbers on for 7 murders because there is this dispute. And in this particular copy of the Police Illustrated Gazette as well, it names 7 victims. Today, it's usually accepted that it's numbers 3 through to 7 who are considered to be the canonical murders, the ones that are generally accepted to have been committed by the character we call Jack the Ripper. There is contemporary agreement with this. The police surgeon was of a mind at the time, Thomas Bond was of a mind at the time, that these 5 murders were committed by the same person because of the nature of the injuries, but we'll come on to those a little bit later on. The first 2 there, Emma Smith, Martha Tabram. In fact, there are 11 murders over a period of about a year that at times when people have been trying to put through their theories, they tried to link together as perhaps having been committed by Jack the Ripper. But we'll just deal with the canonical 5. So this is the Police Illustrated News for the first of the murders that's now accepted to have been committed by the character Jack the Ripper. This is the Police Illustrated News. We see there a page, as Ian said, of one of these publications, which has quite a huge circulation at the time. They were very popular. It doesn't sound very expensive to us, 1 penny, but it probably was quite expensive at the time, but they were hugely popular. And it's reporting various crimes. The front cover there, in the middle, we have Mary Ann Nichols. Here's the close-up of Mary Ann Nichols. 31st of August, 1888. Her body is discovered. Various stories about who actually discovered her body in Back's Row. There was a draftsman who was leading a horse in at the time. His horse shied, and it's meant to have been, it could have even disturbed the Ripper at his work at the time. Police officer was called very shortly afterwards, and they found the body. They didn't realize at first the extent of the injuries. So she'd had her throat cut, and of course she'd had various slashings to her abdomen, and some of her bowel, I think, was exposed as well. This then, as I said, I think is considered to be the first of the canonical murders, and it occurs in Bucks Row, which is the most easterly of the murders. We'll come back to the map as we go through to see how things progress. At the time, people did try and link it to the Emma Smith and the Martha Tabram murders, and information was being sought from the police. The press, again, really wanted to report these crimes because there was a lot of interest in crime, as Ian explained. So they were asking the police for lots of information. The police were not forthcoming. This was part of the criticism of the police as well, because they wouldn't share information with the press. But 7 days afterwards, it was the Manchester Guardian who mentioned that the police were looking for a character called Leather Apron. So those of you who are familiar with the murders may have heard of that character as well, often put forward as a possible candidate for Jack the Ripper is a character called Leather Apron. There was no evidence at the time that the police were looking for this character. It could have been journalists at the Manchester Guardian who were just trying to elaborate their story of that. We then get the second murder. This is the murder of Annie Chapman, just over a week or so afterwards, on the 8th of September. We see a bit more coverage of this murder on the Police Illustrated News there, with just a couple of other stories down at the bottom there. The majority of the front page is now being covered with this particular murder. And here we have the close-up. Again, Annie Chapman was discovered, her throat had been slit, and much more extensive injuries to her torso. This is one of the murders in which the intestines were actually taken out of the body and thrown over the shoulder. So those of you who are ripperologists and interested in this, if you favor the idea that the Freemasons actually committed these murders, this is one of the murders that's linked into certain traditions to do with Freemasonry. Yes, she was found, you see, this is where she was found then, just a little bit further to the west than the first murder. And we start to see interesting things being portrayed in the press as well. First ideas of who could possibly be the culprit here, pictures of that being put forward. Also, a focus on the police are actually being involved in the investigation, is being shown here as well. So we get Detective Thick being mentioned, who originally is running this. One of the criticisms of the police later, which we're going to come to very shortly, was the fact that you had different forces who start off investigating it. Originally, it's with the Whitechapel division of the Metropolitan Police, then it moves to Scotland Yard, and of course, after the first murder, there's a focus from the city police as well, because that's on a city police ground as well. And there's also more coverage about what evidence has actually been found at the scene as well. So this all becomes part of that story, which then builds into the later mythology, which even goes into things like the films From Hell and other things that Ian was mentioning earlier on. We also see the first mention after this murder of a reward, and the police were heavily criticized for not offering a reward. But there was also, there's evidence that the police did consider offering a reward. In particular, Sir Charles Warren, who was the commissioner at the time, had thought about this, but then thought it was a bad idea. There were some government ministers who weren't too sure that a minute of reward should be offered. So we get the Police Illustrated Gazette is offering a reward. They say £100. And talking to Ian earlier, he said, you've got to try and remember how huge a sum this really was. So this was 100 weeks, I think you were saying, wasn't it? Income at the time, if you were working. So that's why we've got to try and think about what a huge sum of money was actually being offered here. So we get the newspaper offering the reward, but then on the opposite side of the page, they're also saying we've got a special edition of all the information on all of the murders as well. So we want to solve this, but actually we want to cash on this as well. So this is all going on at the same time. And the Punch cartoon that Ian showed you again, this is around about that same time it's being published. Now, Punch had a long history of criticizing the police for incompetence. They also linked that into the incompetence of the government as well and other things. But here we get this cartoon. And again, lots of things in the press about the fact that the police were not solving this. There was an idea that the police didn't care so much because this was a particular area of London where we didn't care about the people. They weren't important anyway. So that sort of all links into the criticism of the police, which will go on throughout these crimes. And of course, it's the same today. We know if there's a series of crimes, if they're unsolved, we've seen various things going on in London at the moment with the Metropolitan Police Commissioner being criticised for crimes. That's what's going to happen. Where did the name Jack the Ripper come from? Well, it comes shortly after the second murder. We get this letter. It's called the Dear Boss letter. 25th of September, it arrives. Well, it's sent postmarked 25th of September. It arrives on the 26th of September at the Central News Agency. And the story is that they got the letter and they just thought it was one of the usual hoax letters. There were lots of letters coming in at the time. A day afterwards, they decided to pass it on to the police. And there are certain things in the letter that make people still today believe that it could have actually been written by Jack the Ripper. So let's focus in on what it says. It's actually signed Jack the Ripper. So this is where the name comes from. There were lots of other letters coming at the time with various names being put on them as well. But this one attracted police attention because of subsequent events as well. So at the top there, we see the next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? We'll wait for the next murders to see why that sort of got picked up in the popular imagination as well as by the police as well. So we then have the double event. So this is famous in Ripper law. We have two murders on the same night. And again, there are disputes about whether these murders are actually linked because of the extent of the injuries of the first victim. So the first victim was Elizabeth Stride. We're now on Sunday, the 30th of September. She's found in the early hours of the morning. She's had a throat cut, but there are no other injuries to the body. So that's why some people say this couldn't be a Ripper murder. Of course, the police at the time did think about this, but they then erred towards the idea that actually he must have been disturbed because shortly afterwards, not too far away, there was another murder, and that was the murder of Catherine Eddowes. And here, again, the throat had been cut. The injuries were even more extreme than previously. And also there was a lot of mutilation to the face. So I think you can see in that sort of close up on the top middle right there, there were V's cut out of the cheeks of the victim. The eyelids have been nicked. And of course, the top of one of the ears have been cut off, which is why there is the link to the Dear Boss letter and why people think this could have been Jack the Ripper. He didn't take the earlobe away with him. They found that in her clothing when they unwrapped, the earlobe fell out. But he did take other trophies as well. And again, that links into later evidence about letters and other things that were sent to the police. So here he took her left kidney, part of her uterus, and a few other minor organs in the body. Probably links into what I think Jasmine's going to be talking about later on, to do with the trophies and serial killers as well. Here, the murder is the first murder is down in Berners Street, and then the second one is over in Mitre Square. And if we look at the first murder and the second murder, we can start to see that we're still in quite a close area altogether. And again, those of you who are involved in speculating on who the murderer could have been, you see with this sort of close idea, the focus has always been, would be on someone who had a good knowledge of the area. We could move quickly through this particular area as well. The next important clue at the time the police believed they received was this, a postcard. The postcard was signed Saucy Jack, and the reason it was considered to be such an important clue is it arrived literally the next morning after the double event. And because it talks about some of the things that went on in those murders, it was said it arrived so quickly, it must have been the murderer who actually posted this. So again, there was a focus on this. And famously, this is the text. I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow, double event this time. Number one, squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears off the police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper. So again, this sort of reinforced the use of that name and became part of the mythology. And by the way, if you're looking to actually see these letters, this is lost. This is one of the lost letters. So this is a facsimile of the card. The other letters are actually, I think one of them is in the police museum. One of them was in a private collection for a while, but one of them is in the crime museum in Scotland Yard. But you have to get special permission to go and see that, I think. So the academics amongst us, we might be able to get permission apparently to go and see that if you ever want to see the original letters. And then we get the From Hell letter, which of course becomes the name of the famous graphic novel and the film with Johnny Depp, which I didn't think was too bad, even if Ian wasn't too keen on it. But From Hell, famously, this is the letter that is sent to the head of a local vigilante committee. And that again was an important thing, that a committee had been formed of local people to try and protect people in the East End because they didn't feel that the police could actually protect them. So Mr. Lusk was the head. He receives this letter on the 15th of October. And we see, you know, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman preserved, all of the various things that have been said. It included with the letter was half of a human kidney. When it was examined by the police surgeons, they said that it was a human kidney. It also was a left kidney, which of course was the kidney that had been removed from Catherine Eddowes as well. Now, we don't know that it was Catherine Eddowes' kidney. It had been preserved in some basic alcohol. There was speculation that it could have been medical students and some sort of, or journalists again, just trying to keep the story going as much as possible. At this point, after the so much publicity, we also get the police offering the first reward as well. So it's the city police who actually offer a reward. I should have said the second of the double event killings, of course, occurring in Mitre Square, that was on the city police ground. So you suddenly get another police group being involved in it. Police officers who discuss this, and you get a lot of police officers who today talking about these crimes and about who could possibly have committed them. A lot of police officers have often pointed out, once you start to get different police units investigating together, you often get a lack of cooperation and it causes problems as well. So when people criticize the fact that they never caught anyone for these killings, well, there was also the added issue of different police forces trying to work together. This is one of the letters, by the way, that when it was examined at the time, certain of the wording was picked out as possibly indicating that the killer could be Irish. So back to Ian's ideas of these sort of the others who could be the killers. It was the idea that it might be someone who was Irish from the wording as well. The suspicion that this was actually written by journalists, this was actually not some working class, illiterate person writing the letter, comes about from things like the fact that even though there's lots of misspelling in there, it looks quite deliberate when you consider that the word knife even though it's misspelt with no E, has got the silent K. So that doesn't look like someone who's completely illiterate. And of course, they also point out that while has the H in there as well, which of course, if you were just sort of phonetically putting these things in, you would probably miss that. We then come on to the last of the canonical murders. And this is the murder of Mary Jane Kelly on the 9th of November. By this time, the Police Illustrated News, it's all about the Whitechapel murders. And they become a bestseller in many ways already. The focus in the middle describes the murder. It was interesting earlier, I thought, when Ian said as well, with Johnny Depp and a very pretty lady playing the victims as well, when you actually see the representations, we're not seeing the pretty Hollywood actresses actually being portrayed in the media of the time. There are, by the way, in this particular picture here, some of the elements to do with it. The police were being criticized about the way they were investigating things. As I said before, there were issues with the way that the investigation went, particularly because of the overlaps between the different police forces. But they were trying to use the technology of the time. They were trying to use all of their police knowledge of the time. With this particular murder, we actually can see, I think it's at the top there, on the previous slide, if we get back. You can see they took photographs of the crime scenes, and there are photographs of the crime scenes available for a number of these murders and of the victims as well, post-mortem photographs as well. And that was all sort of pretty new that they were getting into this. I didn't use any of those images, by the way. They are available on the internet, but I thought it was probably better to use the newspaper images. I think they're more graphic in many ways about how people treated this. The last canonical victim then, if we're thinking about how this worked, this was the only victim who was actually killed indoors in her own lodging room. Again, various things put forward about who could have actually got into the house, who could have been trusted enough to be brought into the room to actually then be able to murder Mary Jane Kelly. If we try to plot where all the murders were, and that was the original murder, here we go with the second, the third, the fourth, we see again a very close sort of group together. And again, any of you are interested in any of the theories, if you link this in with some of the other murders, you can form various shapes, you can form crosses. There's a very famous theory about it involved certain black magic practitioners and everything else. So all of these things have been put forward. As Ian said, you Google, there are books, there are films, there's everything about Jack the Ripper. Anyone can put their theory there as well. The police criticism had continued. There've been more problems to do in other areas of London as well. At this point, the police take a really extreme step. They offer a pardon. So this comes out in the same issue of the Police Illustrated News. They actually say, we will pardon. There is a pardon available. It's a pardon for anyone who was an accomplice, not being a person who contrived or actually committed the murder, who shall give such information and evidence as shall lead to discovery and conviction of the person or persons who committed the murder. So really extreme, isn't it, to offer a pardon to people who've been involved, accomplices to the murderer or murderers. It's signed by Charles Warren. It's signed on the 10th of November, 1888. It's unusual. He's the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. Well, he wasn't on the 10th of November because the criticism had got such that actually he had resigned on the 8th. He's actually resigned just before Mary Jane Kelly was actually killed. But of course, there was no one to replace him at the time, so he carried on doing things as well. But that was really the sort of focus of the criticism in the end. A lot of the criticism of the police force did focus on Warren, and there was an issue to do with the whole structure of the police force at the time, and things were changed afterwards because most of the senior police officers, most of those involved in the investigations were former colonial officers. They were usually appointed just because they were friends of someone, they were brought in. Now, Warren was hugely popular actually with all of the officers, even though there were these claims that everything had been run very poorly. He was popular with his officers, and it was said that most of the officers were very sad to see him go. They thought he'd done a very good job in the circumstances, but of course, no one had been caught, and no one ever was caught. The idea of who could have done it, the dean said, I'd tell you who had done it. Well, I'll tell you some of the suspects at the time. I know I'm running out of time, so I better sort of hurry up. There were a number of people arrested. Criticism of the police force for not doing anything. They did investigate. They did interview. There was a suspicion that the murderer could have been a slaughterman or a butcher. So the police interviewed over 200 butchers and slaughtermen, trying to find out any information about them or whatever else. There were other theories that went on. I think a lot of people have this favorite one of the image of Jack the Ripper of someone creeping around with a black bag, perhaps the surgeon or the doctor. And of course, that says a lot about how people felt about doctors and surgeons at the time. And there was a long history, and still is, I think, of distrusting doctors and surgeons. Thank goodness we trust lawyers. Much better to trust lawyers, isn't it? But we can see that here. The startling story of a man with a black bag, and down at the bottom, another strange story told of a man with a black bag. So again, I think in popular literature and films, you've often seen that image of someone carrying this sort of little Gladstone bag around, which carries all these horrible sort of surgeon's tools or whatever else. The police themselves focused in on probably what we'd all think of, the sensible idea of who would be in the area, who possibly would have carried out these crimes. They were looking for people with erratic behavior, what today we might think of as people with mental illnesses and everything else. They did again interview a number of people. There are various, again, if you go to the different books in the literature, they talk about the books that were written by Aberline and by others later on, and memoirs that came out involving certain statements from some of these police officers and some of the senior police officers who were involved in the case. I think the sensible thing is to not think about Masonic conspiracies or members of the royal family or artists who were just having a bad day or whatever else, or whatever, or cover-ups. For the royal family one, it's the idea that Mary Jane Kelly had a child, isn't it, by Prince Edward or whatever. So all of these different things that went on, I think we should just focus in what the senior police officer at the time probably focused in. It was probably someone with a mental illness in the area. There was an idea at one point that there was a local Jewish immigrant who was suspected of this. After the second of the double event killings, part of Catherine Eddowes' apron was found in a building nearby. And again, there's a famous, this comes into a lot of Ripper law as well. On the wall above this was written a statement which involved the words Jews, J-U-W-E-S, which a lot of people believe means Jews. So again, because of this anti-Semitic feeling all over, well, throughout British society, I think at the time, there was concern about this. And Warren actually ordered that that should be removed, that particular statement, because he didn't want to cause any troubles. And again, to think about Warren and what he did at the time, he had overseen the Bloody Sunday, all the issues that went on the previous year and everything else. So he'd already been involved in riots in London. He was trying to avoid any more trouble. It probably was, I think, someone with a mental disorder, probably a poor Jewish immigrant at the time, but we'll never know. Just one more thing, this final murder being reported in the Police Illustrated Gazette, they no longer talk about a reward, but they do tell you about special issues that they're going to be bringing out. And now they're going to bring you the information about all the murders together. So you need to get your orders in quickly, because this is obviously going to sell very well. So the press, I think, a lot to do with this. Ian's title, The First Media Serial Killer, definitely, I think this is why these things became so famous. So thank you very much. That's just a bit on the murders. And now I think we can have, if anyone has got any questions for Ian. I don't know if any have come through. I think we've got enough time for a question or two. I think the Dean has a question. Ian, do you want to come up to answer, or shall I? Probably better.
Thank you for the very interesting presentations, both. I had one observation and one question. The first one is, you said, Ian, that the criminals were labeled as a race, a class in those days. That reminded me very much of Germany during the Nazi time. Even the German civil code reflected that. And as a law student, we were tortured with the reinterpretation of the civil code because that was not appropriate any longer. Quite interesting. And then the question I have is about the second letter. This is actually for Steve. The second letter we received, there were details mentioned which could have been known only by the murderer, correct? And the third one as well, it was pretty detailed descriptions of what had happened. So these people must have known, right? The first one you said came on the morning after the murder.
Well, the first one is the Dear Boss one, which
Yes.
refers to I shall clip her ears next time. So everyone focused on the fact that Catherine Eddowes had part of her earlobe removed. But the second one is the Saucy Jack postcard,
Correct.
which is the one that arrived so quickly afterwards. Now, again, I think originally the police thought about this, but then they checked up and realized that it could have been, the news would have been known about very quickly. Again, if we think about how newspapers used to work as well, they would publish very quickly, and of course the word would go around. So again, if you're a journalist and you know about this and you want to promote the story, you write something very quickly, send it in to yourself, and then report it in.
There was even an area in the newspaper, the stop press.
So
It was deliberately for like late news coming in where you could get things in and then have the full story the day after, and that's the next edition.
but it's very useful if you're writing a book with a theory about it. Sorry, Paul. Yeah.
Yes, Stephen, is there any theory about why the murders actually stopped in the end? Because you'd think, you know, someone had a mental illness, there was going to be some event which obviously maybe ended their life or some other reason. Is there any theories about that?
No, I'm not so much engaged. You know, as a historian, you want to deal with the facts. I know there's various ideas that it was it Tumblety, the guy who went on a boat to America, and that's why it stopped, because he then went on a killing spree in America. And, you know,
Yes. Well, I know we got some people here who are experts in this area as well, but the for me, Tumblety, the police interviewed him. He was very famous because he did come to London and apparently was trying to buy certain female organs as well. So it was a very strange character in many ways. But again, if you believe the Montague Druitt theory, he committed suicide. They found the body in the Thames. That was the idea. He was the medical student come lawyer or whatever else, that one. And then, of course, the poor Jewish immigrant, the idea there was one identified by one of the ripperologists who had been arrested by the police. There was evidence he'd been arrested. And then he's managed to find, he thinks, tying evidence for this particular character to have been admitted to an insane asylum around about that time. So,
what I want to do, sorry, if you don't mind,
sure,
I just want to share the screen, because I think what's really important that people miss is actually what is Whitechapel. There's a lot of what Whitechapel symbolizes in terms of problems. And I mentioned about the volume of people living in poverty. But I think what's really important for me as a historian, as an urban historian, is the design of the area. It's it gets often neglected. And if we kind of just zoom in, you can see here, this is the Charles Booth map. What this map does is not only show the cartographic layout, the layout, physical layout of London, but what it does is it's color coded according to class. So essentially, if we just zoom out a little bit, oops, excuse me, you can see that in the west of London, there's much more yellow and red, which represents wealth. Okay, and you can see that it's a very organized layout. Now, if we come into Whitechapel, which is really one of the major roads that leads out east, and if you zoom in, now I know, Stephen, you put your, you were using your PowerPoint with the map,
yes.
but that map is not really representative of all that goes off behind those streets. These are major streets, but you'd have these alleyways, these courts, all stuffed in there. So I think there's a real issue about the fact that if it is one person, they did pretty well to get away with it, given the fact that this is a very populated and very busy area. So I think probably you're kind of risking your arm a lot if you did 5 or 7 murders. But yeah, I mean, if we just kind of, again, I'm just, sorry, looking in this area, there's a hell of a lot that's going off around the back. This is a very poor area. So when you have people without wealth, this area is subdivided. So that's why there's an incredible density. Plots are getting cut. So there's a hell of a lot of buildings, and there's residences, if you call them that. but lodging houses, a hell of a lot of people moving around. So it's very, very likely that you probably realize you're going to get caught if you just do it. I think that's a really underestimated part of the story. People talk about, oh, it's this poor area. Of course it was, but when you go right into the environmental layout, this was a hugely dense, filthy, smelly area. This where the murders are committed, you had to know the layout. You had to have some familiarity. You maybe were brought up in this area. It's not the kind of thing where if you're kind of traveling in and out of London along Whitechapel Road, where you just happen to take a shortcut and end up around the back streets. You wouldn't necessarily do that. So I think there's a really important issue there that sometimes gets underplayed that, again, it's if, but that's the whole point of Jack the Ripper, isn't it? If. It's all based on hypothesis and assumption. That if you were someone was doing it, you probably would realize that where do you go next after this, the violence of the last murder? You can't go any further, literally, unless you, I suppose you cut someone's head off or something and run around the streets with it. But I mean, just the severity of it. And again, the fact that there's so many things happening and nobody's apparently seen anything, you've got to realize at some point, anyone with half a brain is going to get caught at some point. So I think that's a really important thing. Just that an area was just an absolute hive of people and activity. You had to know what familiarity of that layout as well. And therefore you had to have some understanding that you can only do so much. Your luck will run out.
So I think the idea that it's someone from the West End coming down in the carriage,
No.
and that's Mike. I think we wanted to.
Yeah, Steve, you didn't mention, possibly deliberately, the alleged DNA evidence from the apron that fairly squarely names Kaminsky as being the Ripper. What's your view on that?
I think again that sort of idea of it actually being evidence is a bit weak. I don't know. We've got some real lawyers with us here. I say that as in Yasmine's going to be talking soon and does a lot of crime in many different ways. That sort of evidence that they're putting forward at the moment, I'm not sure that's really evidence. I mean, if that was put in front of a court, I think it'd be ripped apart. Well, I mean, even if you can actually identify it after such a long time, there were others. There was the Patricia Cornwall, the author, who went and bought a painting by the artist who's always accused of being involved in these crimes. But she bought a painting to try and find some DNA or a fingerprint of the artist to then match to DNA to be taken from a scarf that could have come from one of the victims, and of course announced, I've solved the crime, which of course she hasn't. But it was, I'm afraid there's just, as Ian said,
They actually found the scarf, didn't they? One of the
that's
victims
the scarf. I think where they said they're trying to take DNA from it.
Yeah,
But if they do, it'll be, it could be the victims or anyone's DNA who've been in contact with her anyway. I mean, if you were defending someone, Yasmine, and someone, they say this is the DNA, well, that woman could have been in contact with many different people. If you can actually take DNA from that scarf, especially after such a that's it. It was good for a documentary. It managed to get a nice documentary. Yeah. Sorry, Stuart.
A question for Ian about this. I was really interested in the bit you were talking about, change in urban design in response to, as a sort of a mechanism of responding to crime. And I just wonder, at this point in history in London, was there any sort of opposition from the people living in those areas, right? I assume people get displaced, as a consequence of this reorganization. Is there any kind of social organization at this point in time, or is this just much a sort of an elite-driven move, and there's no possible opposition to it internally?
Well, of course, people are going to be opposed because you're essentially losing where you live. But what usually happened was when there was a slum clearing scheme, which were not actually, generally were quite small in scale, because to override private property rights, you had to pay excess compensation for the shock of it. So it made it very expensive and it became a tax burden. So that's why eventually by 1890, they believed the best way of actually depopulating these problem areas is actually to have suburban areas for working class people. Yeah, I mean, there was slum clearing and displacement by train companies from the 1840s. There was this notion of what's called rail land hunger, where the railway companies would find the worst slums and try and map as map a route from the outside of the city to as near to the urban core as they could. And there's no law to protect people, give them, to rehouse them. So what they would simply do is just move as nearby, and it would again exacerbate the issue of the problem of density and overcrowding. I mean, of course, there was famous examples of letters that people wrote about these kind of areas and problems with disease in the 1850s and 1860s, written phonetically, because they were very uneducated and tried their best to expose their thoughts. But so there's letters, there's examples of those from the times. But generally speaking, no kind of formal associations. The formal associations that spoke on behalf of the poor were usually some middle-class reformer. Even things like the Peabody Trust was, again, trying to associate itself with working class betterment and things. But the 1888 is a very important date because it coincides with the formation of the London County Council. So there's now, rather than having 30 or so local councils in London, it's amalgamated into one. And so there's this new notion of what governance can achieve. So again, you find a lot more slum clearing, a lot more rehousing. For instance, you can see it on this particular picture just here. Okay, this area was a notorious slum, and they basically cleared it, and you can see they're rebuilding it with a completely different morphology and mid-rise housing. So there were things going on that were state-driven, but again, it's very kind of top-down. There's very little bottom-up evidence of the working classes actually having any influence upon society for their own good.
A question about social reform.
Yeah.
I think you sort of touched on some of that anyway, haven't you, really?
No, I mean, did it lead to important social reforms? Well, there was things happening at that time anyway. So there's a kind of neat chronological coincidence. And again, I think the London County Council, when they created this, well, it existed until Thatcher basically closed it down. So it existed for about 100 years. But again, when it was formed, it was, there's a lot of enthusiasm. We can do things now. We think about the city, think of more macro level. But again, there was a hell of a lot of slum clearing schemes that were taking place, but it was just considered a very, very expensive proposition. Came understood. And again, by 1890, there's the Housing of the Working Classes Act. You have the example of municipalization of public transport systems in a number of cities, cheap worker ticket acts. Now they're kind of more affordable to artisans rather than the very, very poorest, but it's all about depopulating the inner cities and again, giving that kind of middle class suburbia, that social downward diffusion, not just necessarily of a lower density environment, but again, what that environment represented, and giving that as a state enterprise for the working classes. And ultimately, that was one of the influences by 1909 that leads to the Town Planning Act, which is the world's first act to have town planning in its title, which is really, again, about low density cottage style housing now, again, for the working classes. But again, it was developed by middle class people with kind of socialist leanings, architects, yeah.
I think we're sort of out of time now on that one. So we were going to have a short break to allow people to stretch their legs in the room. So I think if we have a 5-minute break, then we can get Yasmine in to move us 6,000 plus miles over and talk about serial killers in Hong Kong. So we'll have a quick 5-minute break. Thank you very much. But for this part, we're very lucky to have with us Yasmine Zahir, who's a barrister at Liberty Chambers. And Yasmine's practices in both civil and criminal litigation, but I think she errs towards the criminal side. Definitely a criminal. So, and she's appeared in all of Hong Kong's courts. So she's had experience of appearing in criminal matters throughout the Hong Kong courts as well. Appearing for both the prosecution and the defense, involving criminal matters such as drugs, assault, immigration, trademark, road traffic, and commercial crime as well. And even such exotic areas as corporate manslaughter as well. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I won't say too much. I'll let Yasmine talk to you about Hong Kong serial killers. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, Steve. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about Hong Kong serial killers. Sorry, Steve, can I get the PowerPoint? Yeah, I mean, you can obviously tell, not a professor. Okay, so as previously Steve and Ian were talking about, that the media obviously played a really important role with reporting crimes, especially murders, homicides. And it's the gore, it's the blood, it's the shock, it's the fascination, it's the disgust. Those are really the elements that draws the public's attention. In my opinion, it's a little bit like, to be honest, a horror movie where you're scared, but you want to know what happens next. So there's that, you know, nerve, but also fascination that comes with it. It's captivating. Recent examples, of course, include the guy that was recently arrested for the death of the taxi driver. We've also got Squid Game, ranked #1 on Netflix. So when you take it up a notch, and when you've got multiple murders that are committed by one particular person, then that fascination, that shock is even more so. With Jack's legacy, Jack being Jack the Ripper, being Saucy Jack. Now, his legacy obviously was not a positive one. Simply, his legacy just means more serial killers. And frankly, a trail of really traumatic memories, especially for the victim and victims' families. And of course, today I'm going to be focusing on the serial killers in Hong Kong. But before that, I want to look at the definition of serial killer. Now, what is a serial killer? Serial killers we usually think of as people who have committed murders of of 3 or more people, usually in different settings with a cooling off period in between. So they commit a murder and then there's a time period, there's a time lapse, and then they go and murder somebody else. In my opinion, I always think hurt people. So if you've received that hurt and you don't then learn to heal from it, you don't get help professionally with it, then sometimes you could pass on that hurt to other people. And that's the situation with serial killers. Usually they are people who have experienced some sort of trauma in their past, some form of abuse, whether it's physical, whether it's sexual, in their formative years, in their youth. And usually there is a pattern with the way that they commit these crimes. So in particular, we have perhaps a pattern in the physical features of the victims. We have, for example, the Jack the Ripper situation where you've got a murder tending towards young women, sex workers, casually defined. But obviously there will be exceptions to this. And when I say that, I'm thinking of Richard Ramirez in the US, who colloquially is known as the Night Stalker, who basically would break into people's homes and then would obviously rob and obviously would kill people, would sexually assault people. Now, his category of victims were anyone, including old ladies, old men, kids, women, men. So he really didn't have a particular category of people that he would kill. So obviously that is an exception. The manner of killing is also something that you could find a pattern in. So for example, there will be killers who go in for strangulation. There will be killers who go in for slits. I know Ian said earlier on that he didn't want to go into gory details because obviously it's disgusting. Now for the purposes of my hour, I will be talking a little bit about the details and the homicides within reason, because I don't want to traumatize the audience too much, but there will be a little bit of difference between my talk and Ian's talk earlier on. And also the manner in the body disposals. So that's also something that you can find a pattern in with serial killers. This comparatively would make it easier for the police to trace. For example, if you do have a map and you do have murders dotted across different parts of the map, where you have that consistency in, for example, the victims that were murdered, or for example, the ways that they were killed, or the ways that their bodies were disposed of, the police could then link up these various similar homicides in different parts, and comparatively would be easier in their investigation. Usually these murders, murders in general would be committed by people that are close to you. For example, your friends or your family, usually for specific reasons, for money, for love. And because of that, that I think is the reason why serial killers are so chilling, because it's a murder to a high number of just random strangers. And that's the chilling part to it, I think. Usually there will be a connection between sex and violence in the commission of the offense, where the murder would follow some form of sexual assault. For example, Jack the Ripper, there was a connection between the sex and the violence. We've got the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, who you may be interested to know recently died after contracting COVID in 2020. So I thought that might be a little bit of trivia that everybody would be interested in. We've also got Ted Bundy, who also went in for tokens. So he would, apologize for this, but he would sever the heads and then he would display the heads as token. Of course, it's not the case that all serial killers will commit murders and sexually assault their victims prior to murdering them. We do have exceptions, for example, like Harold Shipman in the UK, who was a doctor that would target his patients, usually older people who were about to die, and then he would somehow convince them to put him down as part of their wills so that he would get part of their estate. Now, he was quite a bad case. I mean, I think was charged only for 15 murders, but the total number of victims was thought to be around 250. So, yep, that guy's a big deal. With the Hong Kong serial killers, today I aim to tell you about two of them, and if I have time, if I haven't traumatized you enough, I propose to tell you also about the Tuen Mun Rapist. Thankfully, in Hong Kong, we don't have a long history of serial killers. And I think it's quite good news, and we're quite lucky in that sense, especially when you think in terms of spacing. We do live very close to each other. The homes are usually, flats, apartments, we always have to build upwards as opposed to horizontally. So where there are disputes, where there are arguments, where there are conflicts, tensions, it's harder for the anger to diffuse. And when you think in the context of that, that we don't have a really long history of serial killing, I do think that is commendable. First of all, I'm going to start with the Jars murders. In terms of an equivalent that we could find in Hong Kong, I would say this is probably the closest to Jack the Ripper. This happened in the early 1980s. Total number of victims, 4. Now, he was a night shift taxi driver. So at the beginning, he started small. So at the beginning, he would go to the female toilets. He would take photos of women in cubicles. He was a voyeur. But that wasn't enough for him. And obviously, he also wanted to avoid angry women who found out that he was taking photos from under the cubicles and would run after him. He wanted to avoid that level of confrontation. So then he deviated a little bit. And what he would do is he would peck up female passengers, supposedly on rainy days, hence the Chinese name Yu Ye Tou Fu. I think usually it was on rainy days, but obviously I was not there, so I don't know whether on 4 occasions it was raining on the evenings consistently. So what happened was that he would pick up these girls from bars, and these girls he would consider as what he thought as bad girls because they were working the bar scene. At that time, bear in mind that we were living in quite a conservative Hong Kong culture. The exception was his last victim, who was a 17-year-old schoolgirl that she picked up. Manner of killing. he would kill them by strangulation, using an electric wire. That, generally speaking, is considered to be one of the worst ways that you could kill somebody because of the level of intimacy that comes with it, where when you strangle somebody, you actually have to look at them in the face. You're in very close proximity in the commission of this offense. Now, obviously, a big question is, well, how was he caught? How was he found out? This guy, Lam, he was very into photography. He liked taking videos, he liked taking photos. And what he did was, one time he got some of his photos developed in a Kodak shop. And the guy that developed photographs, I mean, he's used to seeing photographs with a pornographic element, where, you know, there would be couples that would take naughty photos, and he would be used to that. So he wouldn't generally be surprised by that. But then when he came across Lam's batch of photos, and then he saw photos of severed female sexual organs, that was when he thought, something suspicious there. So what he did was he then reported this to the police, who then got pathologists involved. And then what the police decided to do was, let's wait for this guy to come back. So they got the photo guy to call this guy up and said to him, hey, your photos are ready to be collected. And so the police was planning on waiting for him to collect the photos and then just show up and arrest him. So that was the plan. So then, as planned, he came. As planned, he collected his photos. What he did was he drove his taxi up to the Kodak shop, and then he got off, and then he picked up these photos, and then the police showed up. They then searched his taxi, and then they found a knife. Now, ordinarily, I think if you find a knife anywhere outside a kitchen, I think it's pretty suspicious, and it can be pretty menacing. But in the context of this guy, I think finding a knife was actually the mildest part to the story. I mean, little did the police then know that they were about to uncover one of the most gruesome set of serial killings in the history of Hong Kong. And the police confronted him, and the police asked him, hey, what do you say about these photos that you developed? What is your connection to these photos? And then he said, these photos belong to my friend who worked on a ship, and I would meet him shortly to pass these photos on to him. Classic excuse, blame it on your friend. So the police thought, okay, well, we'll wait for your friend. Obviously, this friend never showed up. And so what they did was they took Lam back to his own home, wanting to do a house search. At that time, Lam was living with his parents and his brother in a very small flat. And so they went into his flat and they did a house search. What they uncovered were photos of body parts, photos of dismemberment, cutting off heads, videos of him actually doing it. And he would film himself disposing of the body in different ways. And the worst find of all were these Tupperware containers in which there were female body parts in chemical, so preserved in some sort of way. And that was the most disturbing part of the story, hence the name Jar's Murder. Now, I hope at this juncture that you realize why there are no pictures on my slide. Hope you appreciate how much effort I put into this PowerPoint. It was a considered decision that I decided not to put any photos, because I feel like the story itself is sufficiently graphic, sufficiently gory, that I wouldn't need any visual aid. And also I thought, well, you know, should I put photos of the guy here, but then I thought I'm not really promoting anybody, am I? So let's just get on with the story sans distraction, okay? I thought myself that the really interesting thing about this case, if you didn't find what happened before interesting enough, is what happened afterwards. Because this guy was put through a 3-week-long trial before a 7-man jury. Obviously, he was convicted of murder, and then he was sentenced to death by hanging. Now, at that time, in the 1980s, early 1980s, I think it was 1984 that he was sentenced to death, the death penalty was still around, and the execution chambers in Stanley Prison was actually still kept up and running until the early 1990s, I think. So at the time of the 1980s, death penalty was still around, but it wasn't really enforced anymore. And I think the last death sentence in Hong Kong that was actually enforced was in the 1966. It was in 1966. And the reason for that is because the UK at the time, which was the colonial power of Hong Kong, governing Hong Kong, they were beginning to abolish capital punishment in 1965, around then. And so Hong Kong, being a colony of the UK, was obviously influenced by that decision as well. So whilst the death penalty was still by law available to be deployed, it wasn't really enforced. Another reason is that a lot of the murder trials that were heard in courts, the jurors didn't really want to enter a verdict of murder. Often with the death penalty around, they wanted to return verdicts of manslaughter, because with murder, it would result in a mandatory death sentence. And often was the case that the jurors didn't want to have the responsibility of sending somebody to death, especially when you know that there are margins of errors, and you know that people could sometimes get these things wrong, and there's no way of bringing the dead back. So when this guy, Lam, was sentenced to death, you can imagine the high extent of public outrage and public pressure there was to actually punish this man for his atrocious crimes. There was a lot of public pressure at that time to sentence this guy to death. And with the death sentence at the time, the governor of Hong Kong needed, he had a special power, he had a prerogative to commute these death sentences to life imprisonment. The governor at the time, this guy, Murray Mucklehose, he refused to commute the death sentence. And the reason for that was because of the public pressure that came and the outrage that came with this case. The Foreign Secretary of the UK then called Murray Mucklehose and said, can you commute the sentence to a life imprisonment? Murray Mucklehose said, nope, that's my decision, so I'm not going to commute it, and that's that. And what the Foreign Secretary did was that he went to the Queen, and on advice of the Foreign Secretary, the Queen commuted the death sentence to life imprisonment. So Lam didn't get executed. He wasn't sentenced to death in the end. And you will be interested to know that recently he's been released. I think that's the case. Recently he's been released because after you are sentenced to murder, there is a mechanism in the law, which is the long-term prison sentences review, which is, there is a board for this. And what they do is they review really serious cases of life imprisonment, or generally life imprisonment cases they would review. And then your case, when you've served enough time, would automatically be put before the board for the board to consider whether, in the context of the gravity of the offense that you have committed, you have served enough time for it. So this guy, I think when he was first arrested, when it all happened, I think he was in his late 20s, so 27, 28, recently released, so he would have served about 40 years of time. So to give you the idea, the mass, that's the sort of figure that we're looking at. So that I would say is probably the most gruesome serial killing in the history of Hong Kong. Now, I would fast forward a little bit and talk about a more recent example, and that is Rurik Jutting. Rurik Jutting was quite high profile. I think it was around 2016. A banker from UK originally who was working in Hong Kong, and he lived in a flat in Wan Chai. Total number of victims, 2. So if we go back to the definition that I gave earlier on of somebody who's committed a murder of 3 or more, then technically speaking, he doesn't really fall within that. However, I would argue that because he had given several video recorded interviews when the police arrested him, and he said, well, he found this new excitement, this thrill in murdering victims and killing them, that I would argue that had he not been arrested then, that he would have gone on and committed even more murders. Again, with Jutting, we do see similarities to the Jack the Ripper case, in that he targeted prostitutes. Okay, so again, you know, casual sex workers, prostitutes, it's female workers loosely in that trade, however you want to define it. So both victims were Indonesian prostitutes, and what he did was he tortured and eventually murdered them. Talk a little bit about his first victim first. His first victim was subjected to 3 days of torture. And what he would do is he would tell this girl that he was part of a gang of experts that were really used to torturing and killing people, and he was experienced in doing it many times, and terrified this girl to the point where she innocently thought that if she didn't put up any resistance, if she let this guy do what he wanted to do to her, that eventually she would not be killed if she was compliant. Obviously, she went on to be murdered, but she basically put up no resistance in this process of torture, which was really sad, because then you see a level of emotional blackmail, emotional manipulation that also comes with such a gory crime. Similar to Lam, he made records, but of course we're living in modern times, so the records were made on his iPhone, and he would give monologues of what he did. He would describe to a huge extent the details of how he would torture this girl, how he would commit the crime. And obviously he would also do video recording similar to the Jars murderer. Those were eventually evidence that was used in the trial against him. What I think made it more sinister was the fact that he said that he actually knew the victim from before, and he actually liked the victim. So yep, there is an element of paradox here, but yeah, there we are. We've got the second victim who was murdered 4 days later. So that's the cooling off period that I was telling you about, that waited a couple of days, 4 days. And this time he wanted to make it bigger, badder, more cruel. So what he did was he went to one of these tool stores, and he invested about $7,000 in torture tools, and he got all this equipment fully equipped, and then he picked up this girl, took the girl back to the flat. By then he had put the body of the first victim in a suitcase and left the suitcase on a balcony. Yeah, I'm seeing distressed looks. Yeah, so then the second victim then went into this flat and then saw the situation, and then I think she saw some material, realized that she was in danger, tried to escape, could not escape. She was killed. And I think in both victims, the manner of killing was a slitting of the throat, which is very, very brutal. And what he did was he then called the police himself after the murder of the second victim. And so what the police saw when they entered into his flat was the second victim in a pool of blood. And then you've obviously got the first victim in a suitcase. So he was charged with 2 murders and also 1 count of unlawful burial of the first victim. And because I'm a lawyer, and because this is a talk organized by the law faculty, then I feel like it would be very appropriate for me to talk a little bit about the trial and what happened afterwards, of course. So at trial, he pleaded not guilty to murder, and then he entered a plea of guilty for manslaughter, but the prosecution didn't accept the guilty pleas to manslaughter. They wanted to go ahead with the murder. With the trial, like I said before, they adduced evidence of the video clips of the photos on his iPhone. The police took a couple of VRIs, the video recorded interviews, with him, in which he made admissions. So the prosecution relied on those video recorded interviews to convict him. In the trial, the defendant Jutting, he didn't actually give evidence himself. Obviously, we know that he has a right to elect not to give evidence, and he exercised that right, and he chose not to give evidence. However, the defense did call 2 experts on forensic psychiatry to give evidence. And what they said was that this guy was suffering from 4 mental disorders: alcohol abuse disorder, substance abuse disorder, we've got sexual sadism disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. Okay, so those were the 4 mental disorders, and they concluded the defense case, relying on these experts. They said that he suffered from an abnormality of mind, which was induced by a disease, which substantially impaired his ability to control his behavior, substantially impaired his mental responsibility on the killing of the 2 victims. The prosecution then called 2 experts in rebuttal. So they then called 2 psychiatrists who did agree with 3 of the 4 disorders that the defense experts diagnosed, which was the substance abuse, the alcohol abuse, and the sexual sadism. They said that this guy had narcissistic traits in him, but that they said it wasn't to be diagnosed as a disorder per se. They said that, yes, there was an abnormality of the mind, but this guy wasn't substantially impaired in his mental responsibility for the killing of 2 victims. So that was how the expert evidence was dealt with at the trial level. And then in summing up, the judge, and I'll read out this quoted part because this was what was then subject to contention later on in appeal. The judge said, whether the issue is whether at the time of the killing, the defendant was suffering from an abnormality of mind arising from disease or inherent cause, which must have substantially impaired his mental responsibility for what he did. So that was what the judge said was the main point. And on appeal, there were 2 main grounds in just that were put forward. One, the appeal lawyers said, well, the judge was wrong in saying that only a disorder would constitute an abnormality of mind, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a disorder. And so the defense tried to argue, well, the appellants at that stage tried to argue that the test should be whether these traits would constitute a state of mind so different from that of ordinary human beings that you would consider it abnormal. So that's what the defendant said the test should be. in his appeal grounds. And the second ground of appeal, which was later subject to contention again, was whether or not the experts were able to determine whether the defendant was substantially impaired for the purposes of running the defense of diminished responsibility, which was what he ran in trial. Court of Appeal dismissed both grounds, dismissed the arguments. They took it up to the Court of Final Appeal, who also dismissed both arguments. And so he then had to serve his life sentences. And the count for unlawful burial, which compared to the murders was not as serious, obviously. Now, like I said, we do have time, so I will be able to talk to you about the Tuen Mun Rapist. I think this is quite an interesting story as well. There are little nuances here and there. This case, actually, I think, probably got the most media attention of all of these stories, because if you think about it, the Jutting case, the two murders happened in very close proximity of time. So there wasn't a lot of allowance for media coverage. With the taxi driver, sorry to say this, but he cut up body parts, and then there were body parts that would occasionally kind of float up from rivers. But it was close in proximity in time, but the victims were not so high in number that there was enough time for media coverage to milk, if you will. So with the Tuen Mun Rapist, we're looking at 7 robberies, we're looking at 8 rapes, and we're looking at 3 murders. And this happened over quite a long period of time. And so there was sufficient crimes that happened in between for the media to make a meal out of it over a long period of time. So I would say the media coverage in this case probably more compared to the first 2. So because of the number of victims that were involved, I mean, there were 3 murders, but I mean, the 8 rapes preconditioned the severity of the whole thing. So by the time the 3 murders happened, there was already a lot of media attention and focus on it. And in this case, the police were criticized to quite a large extent, because public was always like, well, have you caught this guy already? And so it was quite a difficult time for the police at that time. This guy, the Tuen Mun Rapist, obviously he was living in Tuen Mun at the time. Modus operandi, what he would do was he would ambush women in elevators and lifts, and he would then gag them, make them unconscious. Then what he would do is he would then drag their bodies to the back of staircases, and then he would rape them there. And obviously there would be robbery as well, but I guess in the context of what we're saying, the rape really should be the focus here. And he would rape them and then would just leave. And then these girls would wake up, become conscious again, and then they would realize that they've been raped. At the beginning, he wouldn't kill these girls. He would just rape them and then just leave. But then he went on and started killing these women. The first woman that he killed was a 50-year-old that he only realized the day after that he killed. He didn't know when he killed her that he killed her. So it was only afterwards, when he was watching the news, that he realized, oh no, I killed this woman. For the police, there was a witch hunt for this guy, because serious, there were rapes, serious that there were a lot of rapes happening in that vicinity, but it's really difficult to ignore the state of affairs when you've got a woman that's been murdered. So then the police had to really pull up their socks, and they really wanted to locate this guy. The media was obviously giving the police a really hard time. There was a lot of public pressure on the police to find this guy and arrest him. So because he saw all these news clippings, he saw all these reportings on TV, this guy panicked. So what he did was one day he rang up his friend, and it was his school friend that he hadn't been in contact with, because this guy, the Tuen Mun Rapist, also a Lam, okay, his surname is also Lam. He was a bit of a loner. So what he would do is he would usually just walk in the neighborhood of Tuen Mun on his own, and he would just walk around on his own. And he didn't really have any companions or didn't really have any good friends. So this guy that he called up was his school friend from many years ago that he had already lost touch with. But then he called him up, and then he said to his friend, and he could hear in the background at his friend's home that there was this report of the killing of this 50-year-old woman. And then he said to his friend, oh, hi, I did it. Because I think he was so nervous, he was panicking. And I guess he probably just wanted to vent to somebody. And then he basically told his friend that, oh, well, I committed this murder. And then the friend hung up. And then the friend thought to himself, well, you put me in a really difficult position, because do I dob on you? Do I tell the police that you have just confessed to me? Or do I just keep quiet? But what about my responsibilities? I mean, if I were to ignore this and more people are raped and more people are killed, then it's on my head. So the friend was sort of annoyed that he was somehow put in this position unsolicited, right? Just got a random call from this guy who's lost touch with him for years. And then what he then decided to do was, because the police investigations were rife at that time to locate this man, he then called up the police, his friend, anonymously, and said, hey, you should make the photo fit, because they had done a construction of who they thought it was. You should make the photo fit face a little bit thinner, and then hung up. So it was, he gave some help, but he didn't disclose everything. So that was the route that he went down. And then we've got the media and the press making Lam more nervous as well. So when people are nervous, then they start making mistakes, and they start making changes to their usual habits. So what he did was then he moved from Tuen Mun to Hong Kong to live with his elder sister for a while. But then, like we were saying about Jack the Ripper possibly going into America and maybe committing murder spree in America, I think the crimes then happened in Hong Kong for a while. The last rape that he committed, the girl survived. And this is relevant because after the rape, he wanted to talk to this girl, and he asked this girl to be his girlfriend. You don't rape somebody and then say, oh, can you be my girlfriend, right? But this was what this guy did. So he asked this girl to be his girlfriend, and because the girl obviously felt really scared, didn't know what to do, because she wanted to get out of that situation, she said, yeah. I mean, it's probably worthy to note that this guy, he has a tendency of wanting to talk to his victims after the rape. So there was another case before this girl where he raped the girl, and then the girl was conscious, and she was crying at the back of the staircase. And then he tried to talk to her, and then this girl just went crazy and just constantly slapped the Tuen Mun Rapist. But I think it's kind of unfair to say she went crazy, because I mean, it's legitimate for her to be annoyed, right? To be angry, to be irritated. And then this guy tried to have a conversation with her, but because she kept slapping him, he got provoked and then ended up killing her, which wasn't the intention, but because he somehow was provoked by the slapping, then he killed her. So this guy does have a tendency to want to talk to his victims afterwards. And with his last victim, he then went, oh, hey, yeah, do you want to be my girlfriend? And she said, yeah. And they then agreed to go on a date the next day and to meet outside the cinema for a date. And so obviously the girl, in order to get out of that situation, then said, yeah, I'll meet you outside the cinema. And then she went home. She told her mother-in-law about what happened. And the mother-in-law was concerned, but then said, well, why don't you just keep quiet about it? Don't tell anybody about it. Because again, compared to now, I mean, it shouldn't be the case, but you know, there was this perception that if you've been raped, then it's a shame that you're bringing to the family, so one must keep quiet about it. So that was the view that her mother-in-law took. But obviously, I mean, if you're a woman violated in that way, then it's really difficult to forget. So she couldn't just keep quiet about it. So what she did was then she told her brother, who was a correctional services officer. And so her brother then encouraged her to go to the police and report the rape and tell the police about this date that she was supposed to go to the next day, and that she was supposed to meet this guy outside the cinema. So then again, the police then set up a plan, right? They had a plan. So then they said, okay, well, why don't you go to the cinema, meet him outside, and then we'll have a sign, okay? We'll have a sign, victim. So you'll scratch your head, and then this is our signal. So once you scratch your head, that means you've seen him. That means the guy that you're talking to is the guy that we want to arrest. And then we'll immediately come up and we'll immediately arrest him. So that was the plan, okay? What happened was Lam turned up, and then so she scratched her head, right? There was no response. So she scratched her head, but no police came up, no police showed up. And so what she did was she then scratched her head again. So second time, no response. Nobody was rushing up to arrest the guy that she was talking to. So obviously either the police watching didn't get the memo or just wasn't paying attention. Don't know what happened in the line of communication, but obviously she was panicking. So then she screamed, because I mean, if there's only so many times you can scratch your head, I mean, nobody's responding, right? And so she then screamed, and terrified, he ran because he knew something was up. Then the police tried to run after him, tried to chase him down. They could not. And then eventually the brother of the victim caught up to him and chased him down eventually and caught him. He then later said that if he had worn trainers that day, that he wouldn't be caught. But because he wanted to look nice and impress this girl, he wore leather shoes. I mean, because he did say after the rape to this girl, oh, you know, for our date tomorrow, don't worry, I'm not going to look scruffy. I'm going to dress up really nice for you. And so that unfortunately turned out to be, unfortunately for him, turned out to be his downfall, the leather shoes. What he did afterwards was he pleaded guilty to the robberies. He pleaded guilty to the counts of rape, but then he pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of murder. Eventually, he was convicted to 3 terms of life imprisonment. So this happened in the early 90s. Then they took the case up on appeal. The appeal ground was narrow, and it was this, because the trial team did not contest to the admission of the caution statement, to the video reconstruction and the medical reports, and because they were not challenged in the trial, the judge, in summing up and directing the jury, said, well, jury, you should have no difficulty in finding that the Crown had proven the element of intention for murder. And so that was taken on appeal. where the defense team said, well, just because we didn't challenge the caution statement, the video reconstruction, and the medical reports doesn't mean that automatically the Crown has satisfied the proving beyond reasonable doubt of this intention element in the offense. Dismissed. And that is basically the end of the road for the Tuen Mun Rapist. So there you are. I've got 3 stories for you of serial killing in Hong Kong. I welcome any questions, but that's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for listening. Steve.
Thank you. We've had a question in from Shmuel. He's asking about the social economic background of these Hong Kong killers, because again, I think it touched on when Ian was talking about, we were talking about the Jack the Ripper, the ideas of what people thought who Jack the Ripper would be, where he would come from in the sort of the socioeconomic world. You mentioned that the Jars killer was a taxi driver. Of course, Rurik Jutting was a British banker. What about the Tuen Mun Rapist? Do you know what he did? Or what his background?
I mean, the Tuen Mun Rapist, he was a guy that I think was just meandering a lot in that neighborhood. I don't understand him to have had like a career in a particular industry. From what I understand, he was bored a lot of the time. He was looking for things to do, and he started small with the crimes, and then he elevates, and we've got these murders and rapes in the end.
Well, you mentioned that progression again with the Jars killer as well. The idea that it started with smaller things and moved on. There's one of the theories that comes into the Jack the Ripper where people try to link it to the previous attacks and other things as well. But so yeah, that was Shmuel was just asking on that sort of background there. Any other questions from those things? Dean has a question.
Thanks for an interesting presentation. The Hong Kong is known as a very safe place. Would you, in general, regard Hong Kong as also less intense in terms of capital crimes? As compared with England, for example, with Europe, with the States, is there less murder in Hong Kong?
I would say compared to the UK, compared to the US, definitely the number of killing comparatively is less than those jurisdictions in the UK and the US. I'm not so confident in saying that the manner of killing is not as dramatic, because I mean, like we've seen with the Jars murder, I mean, it's pretty brutal. But I would say in general, the commission of murders, homicides in Hong Kong really is not as serious, not as grave as other jurisdictions, which is why when you get one homicide, it is heavily reported for days in the media in Hong Kong. And that gives you an idea of how big of a deal it is. If you take it to a jurisdiction where the murder rates on a daily count is very high, perhaps the level of attention that the media would be giving to individual cases would be comparatively smaller. Yes.
Yes, and one of the normal legal grounds for defence in murders is diminished responsibility and madness, insaneness, and obviously that applied right the way from Jack the Ripper right through Jutting, and the Tuen Mun Rapist certainly seemed a complete nutter. He wanted to invite the girl out afterwards.
Yeah.
But with Jutting, there were 4 tenets of his defence, 2 of which were mental. But I remember at the time, one of the things he pleaded was diminished responsibility due to the amount of alcohol and drugs that he consumed.
Yeah.
I mean, as an outsider, surely that's a non-starter, because mental, yes, you're born with it, there's nothing you can do. But to say that you're incapable or you can't be held liable because you've got yourself drunk or drugged up, I would hope is a non-starter. But from the legal point of view, is that correct?
Because what he said was that he would use, it wasn't just ordinary drinking or ordinary drug use, if drug use is ordinary by definition, but it was using the drugs, using the cocaine, using the alcohol to fuel his sexual fantasies and torturing these victims. So the issue was where that abuse or where that need for external aid in alcohol and in cocaine was so much so that it was then diagnosed as a disorder by both the defense and the prosecution, then I think it does legitimize this argument of the diminished responsibility, because then it's more than just a hobby of just using the alcohol to have a good time.
So it was a fuel to keep the thing going,
Yeah.
not the cause of it. It was used as something else that was the catalyst.
Well, I mean, he saw it as playing a big part to it, but I think they also found a huge amount of drugs in his home, but I think nobody bothered to charge him with possession or trafficking, right, when you're looking at 2 homicides there. But yeah, definitely. I mean, I would say that when you take it to a certain line and it's actually serious enough to be diagnosed a disorder, then I think it wouldn't necessarily just be a sideline issue. It would just take the spotlight and it would become legitimate ground to say diminished responsibility. But obviously the appeal failed on this idea of whether or not the disorder would constitute an abnormality of the mind. But there we are. And also, sorry, also an interesting thing that one might wonder in these cases is, well, if these men were found, caught post-act to have committed these murders, then why on earth would they go for a trial in these murders as opposed to pleading guilty? I mean, why did these men choose not to plead guilty? Why did the Tuen Mun Rapist plead guilty to the rapes, pleaded guilty to the robberies, but not the murders? And the reason for that is because with murders, they usually would, well, not usually, but they always would carry a mandatory life sentence, whether you pleaded guilty or not. Usually, when you plead guilty in other criminal offenses, you would get a third discount, right? But with murders, even if you plead guilty, you aren't going to be convicted of mandatory life sentence. So usually the people would then choose to see if they can argue diminished responsibility on the disorders, the mental disorders that they had. And also, if you then do a mitigation after a conviction, another legitimate question that is posed is, well, is there much point in doing a mitigation after a conviction of murder? Because usually when people mitigate, it's in the hope of getting a lighter sentence. It's in the hope of saying, well, these are the mitigating circumstances in his offense. So judge, please, can you consider a more lenient case, albeit that he's convicted after trial? And people do mitigations after murders, after convictions of murders. And you might wonder, well, what's the point? Because you're going to be sentenced to a mandatory life imprisonment. And I think the relevance of the mitigation will be shown many years later in this long-term prison sentence review, which I mentioned earlier on, because that in effect is what I would call a parole board, where you give lifers a hope that should they behave well in prison, should they work hard on rehabilitating themselves, in showing that if upon release they would be a benefit to the society, to community, to not be a danger to other people, that there are merits for releasing them. And when many years later the board looks at documents relevant to the cases of these lifers, that mitigation that trial counsel does in the trial hearing could become very relevant. But often it's the case that it's many years later. So I think perhaps those potential questions that people have about murder trials, I would say probably those are my views.
Thank you. We've probably got to move on very quickly. We have got a couple of questions online though. Following on from your point there, I've been asked, do police keep an eye on former murderers? You know, what's happening with the Giles killer now? Do we know?
So there is a mechanism in the law for release of these prisoners. They don't just say, oh, well, let's release you and leave it at that. So they are under quite strict supervision orders or reporting conditions of some form where they are monitored and they are watched. So sometimes the release would be a conditional release. Sometimes it would be under a supervision order where there would be a curfew, you have to come back certain times. And so they are monitored for a while to the point where they are considered to have given sufficient reassurance, sufficient confidence that they would no longer be a danger to society. Would they then be able to live free of these conditions? But there would be a time period for it.
Thank you. And also, did the Tuen Mun Rapist, did he say anything about his motivation for the, I mean, you said he was an aimless character and everything else.
Yeah.
Did he talk a bit about that?
He did explain why he wanted to commit these offenses in certain parts of his confessions. And he would say, oh, well, you know, I would stand in a lift with a woman and I would want to do things to her. I would want to, you know, do unspeakable things to her. And that's why, you know, there are these impulses, and then I would then make her unconscious and take her out. So I think with the Tuen Mun Rapist, you do see similarities with the thought processes of the other serial killers. That there are similarities there, where there is this inexplicable impulse that they have, that they want to hurt the victims. And Jutting himself said, well, the more hurt I can impose on my victim, the more satisfaction I get out of it. And so these are the consistencies usually which I think would group these people together in this category of serial killing.
Thank you very much. Well, thank
you. Made a very interesting point there, Jack the Ripper, Jutting, went out deliberately to find victims. From what you've just said about the Tuen Mun Rapist, he happened to be in a lift by accident and got this impulse. Does that suggest there's two different types of serial killer? There's the impulsive and there's the premeditated, or was he just talking rubbish anyway? Was he just making it up, you think?
I mean, that is probably a question I think that would probably require the expertise more of a psychiatrist as to, you know, where do we draw the line between premeditation and impulse? I mean, if I plan this all in my head, but when I go out of the home, I don't think of enforcing my plan. But then when I see a woman, I know exactly what I want to do to her. Then would that classify in itself as premeditation when at the moment I leave my home, I don't intend on enforcing my plan, but I thought about it prior? So I think there are lines, ambiguous lines that perhaps are drawn between the two. And I think we probably would need a forensic psychiatrist to come in and talk about that one.
Great, thank you very much. I think we better leave it there and have just a few minute break in between for our next speaker. And I hope Jeremy will be with us from London and we can link up and perhaps talk about some of those issues you talked about there, diminished responsibility and everything else. Thank you very much, Yas. Well, thank you very much, everyone. And now we come to our final speaker of the day. Jeremy, I think you can hear me there in London, yes?
Yes, I can.
Excellent, thank you. If I can just introduce to everyone, our final speaker of the day, last but definitely not least, is our great friend, Jeremy Dean QC, is a very great supporter of CUHK Law. So thank you very much for getting up, well, not too early for you, I know you get up early anyway, but for joining us on Zoom for this event and giving us the benefit of your experience to round off the day. So just as a brief introduction for those of you, I'm sure most people do know Jeremy. As I said, he's been involved in a lot of our events already and also is so very well known as well. Jeremy is England's foremost criminal barrister. I think we can say that. I know he's blushing a little bit, but I think we can say that for Jeremy. Very great reputation at the criminal bar. He's been involved in so many cases, as his bio says on our website, homicide cases, sexual offences, all most of serious complex crime. He's been involved in cases through the whole range of the criminal spectrum. So he is an expert in this area. He also may be known to you as well because Jeremy is also a star of the TV as well, because he, of course, is the defence counsel and co-presenter in the highly successful and award-winning BBC documentary series Murder, Mystery and My Family, in which historic death penalty convictions are considered. So that's, again, a great reason for Jeremy being part of this event today. I won't say too much else about Jeremy because I think it would be great just to hand over to Jeremy now. We are going to try and save some time at the end, although I know that Jeremy has to go off to court very shortly. So thank you very much for giving up your time to join us today, Jeremy, and I'll hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, Steve, well, thank you so much for that extremely flattering introduction. I hope I can be seen and heard. Just so you know, Steve, I'm okay for time. So, you know, whatever timetable you want to orchestrate, that's fine by me. I've made the necessary arrangements. And can I say to everyone across the globe, good morning from London. It's a typically sort of grey London morning, quite humid for this time of year, but kind of classic London where no one knows whether to wear a bobble hat and a coat or flip-flops. So for those of you who've been to London or come from England, you'll know exactly how it feels. It is genuinely a great pleasure to be re-involved with CUHK, as Steve has said. It's a place which has become very close to my heart. I've been involved and extremely grateful to be invited to a number of events over the last 5 years, and obviously it'd be fantastic to revisit CUHK and Hong Kong at some point in the near future. And this conference, which Steve mentioned to me when he first thought about it, is of course a fascinating conference, as illustrated by the first two presentations. And the theme of what Steve has asked me to speak about over the next 45 minutes or so is defending the indefensible in the background of the Jack the Ripper murders. So I won't be saying too much about Jack the Ripper, but what I have to say will derive from that backdrop. And as Steve has said, without making any sort of qualitative assessment of myself, the fact is that I've been involved in defending in the criminal court since 1983. And over the last 20 years or so, my work has been predominantly homicide, defending in homicide cases, as well as sitting as a Crown Court recorder, where I'm able to try cases up to serious sex, but recorders, part-time judges, are not authorized to try homicide cases. And what I'm going to speak about this morning is with an emphasis upon defending in homicide cases, but bringing in other aspects. I'm afraid I have not constructed a PowerPoint presentation. There are a number of reasons for that. First, because I'm technically completely incompetent, and I'm worried that if I tried, I'd basically bring down the global internet by pressing the wrong buttons. Secondly, because I don't actually believe that what I'm going to talk about is really conducive to slides or PowerPoint. It's more of a discussion than a lecture. And in that context, if people do want to put questions up, please do. Hopefully I'll be able to see them and sort of bring in responses to them. So I'm sorry if any of you feel that you would have been assisted by a PowerPoint, but that's my defense to my failure in that respect. Can I just very briefly set the scene to the question of, or the issue of defending the indefensible by letting you know that today I have a jury out in retirement in a murder trial I've been doing for the last 6 weeks. There's no problem. My junior counsel is there where she needs to be at the moment. Jury are re-retiring at about this point in time. There was a group of 12 youths who ran down a side street in Brixton about this time last year, chasing a 13th youth who was carrying a knife. The 12 surrounded the 13th, and the 13th was butchered and slaughtered. He was stabbed 41 times and he died. And 3 of the 12 were apprehended and charged and prosecuted for murder. One of those is my client, the first defendant of the 3, who it said was the ringleader. The jury have now been in retirement for 12 working days and have yet to reach a verdict. And I would suggest that that is a good start to discussing the concept of defending the indefensible, because the classic party or dinner party retort to me telling people, if asked, what do you do? I'm a criminal defense barrister, is of course always, well, how can you do that? I mean, what do you want to do that for? They're scum. Or, you know, how can you do that job when you know they're guilty, which is obviously a proposition that makes a number of assumptions. But although the incident that the trial I've been involved in revolves around was essentially caught on CCTV, the complexity of the issues and the nature of the evidence, which includes defense evidence as to action and mental state, has triggered this jury now to be in retirement for more than 2 working weeks, and they still cannot reach verdicts. So that is a prime example, I believe, of the paramount importance of strong and immovable criminal defense, and the proposition that somehow there is a line to be drawn whereby it can be said, how can you defend the indefensible, is an unsustainable position. Apart from my link to this conference being my relationship, if I can call it that, with CUHK, so happens that I was born in precisely the geographical place where Jack the Ripper committed, if he did, the murders that have been discussed today. I was born in Bow. I am a Cockney, a proud Cockney. My parents were born and bred and brought up in Whitechapel. My father was a waiter in a famous restaurant in Whitechapel for 35 years. I am a fanatical West Ham United supporter, as Steve knows. I went to Queen Mary College, University of London, and therefore everything that's been discussed about the East End, and it was fascinating to hear Ian talk a lot about what I'll call the old East End, is extremely close to my heart. And I've also defended and represented many people who emanate from the East End. So that's just a passing comment, which I hope is of some limited interest. Before I come on to discuss, as I've said, in the next half an hour, 35 minutes, aspects of what defending the indefensible is all about, can I just draw briefly from some of the comments made by Ian earlier this morning, because it is in fact remarkable how strong the parallels remain as between Victorian Britain, England, and the modern day society in which I live. Police recorded 5.4 million crimes in England and Wales in the year ending 2021, which so happens is a 10% decrease in the previous year. London had the highest rate of homicide, with Croydon being the most homicidal place. There have already been 600 incidents of homicide in 2021. That's just a little bit of background to what I'm about to say in relation to the comparison with the Victorian scenario. Everything Ian was talking about in terms of public attitudes, the perception that the criminal justice system is not working, the prevailing view that burglars, for example, are all from a different social class. The feelings of people who've been burgled, that invasion of space and violation of property, prevail today. The suggestion that criminals lack moral values and that they simply cannot appreciate the difference between right and wrong hasn't changed in any way. And all of those complications confront the defense lawyer, the defense advocate, when being asked to defend, whether in a contested trial or on a plea of guilty or following conviction on sentence. And the fact is that in modern England, the criminal defense is conducted in a background of huge social divide, high unemployment, lack of social opportunities, very high rates of domestic violence, and totally unfair, unfounded, and misrepresented lack of confidence in the criminal justice system. And on top of that, we have the highest prison population in the free world, approximately 78,000 people, of which many are mentally disordered and should not be in prison, an aspect I'll touch upon again shortly. Our prisons are vastly overcrowded. COVID conditions were as barbaric as anywhere in the free world, where prisoners were locked into cells for 23¾ hours a day, very often without any sanitization whatsoever. And these difficulties are as great today as they have ever been. And in discussing the role of the defense lawyer and drawing upon the comparisons that I have as regards Ian's comments, and considering in particular what he described as ignorant middle-class society, which again is a feature of our modern day society here, that is the framework in which criminal defense has to be conducted, with an overriding misconception that defense lawyers are just there to sort of play tricks on the court or to sort out unjustified technicalities, which is of course simply the ridiculous way of looking at what we do. So I just wanted to sort of rubber stamp that so much of what was said by Ian and then followed up by Steve in terms of talking about the murders themselves are still very much the atmosphere that surrounds the criminal justice system today. And as I've said, I'm going to focus in particular upon defending in homicide cases, but I'm going to sort of, but I'm going to bring in other aspects. Steve has actually asked me to make a few comments about comparison between how it would have been had Jack the Ripper been tried for the murders he's said to have committed back in the late 1880s and today. So can I just deal with that aspect in the following way? It is quite fascinating. A principal distinction would have been the makeup of the jury, because in 19th century England, a jury service was a select obligation which only applied to men aged between 21 and 60. And those men had to meet the property or tax criteria as set out in legislation. I won't go through those criteria because I don't have time. But apart from doctors, surgeons, members of the clergy, army officers, lawyers and court professionals were disqualified. But it's clear at the time of Jack the Ripper that there was huge corruption in that, although jurors were supposed to be selected at random, there's abundant evidence that what I'll call county officials received bribes from people who didn't want to do jury service. That was the culture of the day. And Punch magazine wrote in 1859 that no juror went into the jury box with a happy face. Some men tried to send employees in their place. Others put property in their wives' names in order to avoid eligibility for jury service. That corruption of summoning officers was commonplace. That ward clerks who had access to the jury lists offered men a guarantee against jury service in return for a subscription of £1 guinea per year. And that's how it was. And there is plenty of evidence that even in homicide cases, of which there were an abundance, that jurors often reached a verdict without leaving the jury box. And that until 1870, they would be kept without heating, food, or drink until they reached a verdict, which is probably why they didn't take very long to reach verdicts. And where the jury could not agree, the prisoner would be remanded, and there was in theory no limit on the number of times a prisoner could be retried. Now, that's how it was at the time of Jack the Ripper in that respect. And again, Steve has asked me to talk or weave in my experience. I've been really fortunate to have been involved in this long running BBC documentary series Murder and Mystery in My Family, which each episode of which focuses upon a historic UK death penalty case and looks back at that case under the prism of modern day investigative techniques and from my perspective, legal principles. And those cases, and there are now 50 of those programs, range over the last 250 years. And it is truly, truly chilling and shocking to have learned how convictions were returned over that period of 250 years, how corrupt the jury system was, how quickly jurors came back with verdicts of guilty on the most tenuous evidence in homicide cases, how people were hanged by the neck within days of being found guilty, how there was no constructive right of appeal, and when there was, it was a worthless exercise. We have a much more systematic jury system now. That's not what I'm here to talk about. Just still focusing briefly on the Jack the Ripper era, may also, I hope, would be of interest that there was no right to counsel in felony cases, that's general sort of crime cases at that time. Since the 15th century, it's been customary in capital cases to allow defendants to have counsel to argue law only. Victorian defendants were often denied counsel altogether by judges because they were poor and the judge just didn't like them. Although the general emphasis in the late 1880s was in homicide cases for prisoners not to go undefended, but the judge would simply ask a counsel present in court to undertake the prisoner's defense for no fee. And I have seen myself, again, many times in the historic cases I've witnessed, just how disinterested and unsubstantiated the defense was, because the lawyer was not being paid. And that clearly contributed to many miscarriages of justice. The general emphasis at the time of Jack the Ripper was on mental element rather than act. Most homicide trials appear to have been about the defendant's state of mind. Drunkenness, significantly, seemed to be a prominent defense in the 19th century. So if people were charged with homicide, they would raise drunkenness as the defense. And for a long time, the influence of alcohol appeared to be considered a respectable line of argument, although it was rarely successful. Whereas today it's been stamped out and is essentially, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but strictly limited in terms of its prominence as a defense in a criminal case. And just finally, in terms of discussing how things were at the time of Jack the Ripper, many of the features of the modern day criminal trial, for example, the requirement of the prosecution to disclose evidence and unused material that they weren't relying upon, potentially favorable to the defense, it simply didn't exist, whereas it does today. And so once again, in the many historic cases I've now come across, you see situations in which, in death penalty cases, the accused person simply turns up at court and is told on the day of trial, which very often is the day of conviction, what the evidence is, presented with a free counsel who no doubt had a dinner appointment and other things on his mind. It would generally be a he, not a she. And not surprisingly, the rate of capital punishment was high for a long time, although many death penalty sentences were not in fact carried out, but plenty were. Not, I would suggest, because of the strength of the evidence, but because of the utter, total and complete incompetence of the criminal justice process. So I'm grateful to Steve, because I think it's a very good idea in the context of this conference to have the opportunity to make that comparison. And then moving back to modern times and the whole question of defending in the criminal courts, obviously, and it goes without saying, and naturally, the shape of the criminal trial has changed unrecognizably. In homicide cases, I don't know how much of these aspects have been adopted in Hong Kong today, but there are real difficulties from start to finish. Bail is almost impossible to secure, whatever the strength of the evidence in a homicide case. There's specific legislation relating to bail. Trials are dominated by what we call special measures, whereby prosecution witnesses are given all measure of specific protection in court, for example, giving evidence behind screens so that the defendant, the public gallery, can't see them. And very often the lawyers have real difficulty in seeing them because the makeup of the court makes it physically difficult for us to do so, although it is our right and we insist upon it. Very often witnesses give evidence by TV link rather than coming to court. Anonymity of witnesses is not an insignificant aspect of murder trial proceedings. And the law in the UK, in terms of hearsay and the admission of bad character evidence, that is the bad character evidence of the accused person, has moved very strongly in favour of the admission of both hearsay and bad character. There is a rigorous legislative framework, being the Criminal Justice Act 2003, but it's heavily weighted against the accused and the defence, whereas to secure the admission of prosecution witnesses' bad character is a much higher threshold. So these are all difficulties which characterize the modern day homicide trial in the background of considering how the scales are weighted so far as the fairness and the complexion of the trial is concerned. And on top of that, whereas the families of victims are allowed to sit in the courtroom, and very often there are 8 or 10 of them, which creates a very intimidating atmosphere for the defense. Families of the accused people are not. They have to sit in the public gallery, which quite often is up in the sky. And sentencing hearings are heavily dominated by victim impact statements. So victims are, the families of victims read out long, detailed statements, and I make no criticism, of course, in the respect that they want to express their heartfelt views. But all of this characterizes, as I've said, the modern day homicide trial in this country. So these are features of the challenges. I'm simply pointing them out. I'm not asking for sympathy that the defense face in a background of low resources and all manner of other complications. Now, when the question is posed, well, how can you defend someone who's charged with murder? I mean, that is an extraordinarily complex question to ask, and it's often asked by a person who has no interest in the answer whatsoever. And even if the individual does have some interest, it takes far too long to respond satisfactorily, because the situation in homicide cases is that more often than not, it isn't about did he do it or did she do it? And that's another variation on the theme. Do you think your client did it? It's so often about the distinction between murder and manslaughter. The concept of murder and manslaughter did exist at the time of Jack the Ripper. Doesn't appear, so far as the circumstances of those murders are concerned, that the issue would have arisen in his case, although maybe on a psychiatric level, arguably there could have been scope. But it needs to be stressed that the homicide trial is very often all about whether culpability is murder-based or manslaughter-based. And that distinction is incredibly important, if only from a sentencing point of view, because in this country, the difference in sentence, and I'll deal very briefly with sentence at the end, is absolutely mammoth. And the ramifications for the accused person are huge. And so whilst when an accused person is convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, which happens frequently, those close to the deceased person are generally devastated and angry, a jury will have found that the justice of the case lies with convicting the defendant for murder. And I'm sure everyone is aware, and if I just deal with it briefly, that for murder, the requirement is unlawful killing with intent to kill, alternatively, the infliction of really serious injury, whereas for manslaughter, it's killing. There are a number of variations of manslaughter: unintended death resulting from assault, in other words, perhaps the intention to cause harm but not serious injury or death. There's manslaughter based upon negligence. There's manslaughter arising from mental disorder. There's death by dangerous driving, which is a form of manslaughter, as was a case that I was doing recently where a person ran someone over who got out of their vehicle and claimed that they didn't realize that individual was still standing at the side. There's more complex scenario of fact, but I won't go into it. There are one punch homicide type cases, of which I've done several. For example, a tragic case recently in a supermarket where the defendant got agitated because someone pushed in a queue, went over and punched that what he thought was that person once. That person collapsed and died from a punch, which would usually attract a small fine in the magistrate's court because it was quite a low-level punch. In fact, he misidentified the person who pushed in, and it was a completely, if I can use this word, innocent individual. But clearly the intention of the defendant was just to in a moment of agitation, was a pretty lightweight punch, and I'm not seeking to justify it, but in any event, he was confronted with a homicide charge, pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and for his troubles received a sentence of 5 years. And is that defending the indefensible? I mean, the issues there, when you weigh up competition between morality, culpability and sentence, and factor in what he intended, and on the other hand, the death, are hugely complicated. And the response to the sort of party question, you know, what do you want to waste your time defending someone charged with killing someone, can easily be answered by throwing up examples of that kind. I just want to bring in very briefly sexual offences, because although I'm speaking mainly about homicide, sexual offences, sexual offending is always very sensitive and highly controversial. We have 850,000 people registered on the sex offenders registered in the UK, and that's doubled over the last 12 years. And defending in serious sex cases is a huge, huge challenge. And obviously, many people find us doing that distasteful. But I think in the context of this discussion, I need to point out that the way the criminal trial is involved in this country, so far as serious sexual offence is concerned, is an absolute disgrace, because the concept of a fair trial has been utterly and totally obliterated. In a nutshell, what has happened over the last 10 years is that the right to present a defence has been almost entirely eroded, that there is maximum power given to the judge in the case of almost every sexual offence, in particular where children are concerned and what are called vulnerable witnesses, but that's a very wide concept, to guillotine cross-examination, in other words, to give very short periods of time for the defence to cross-examine. In most cases, the judge and the prosecution are to be provided with the questions the defence want to ask so that they can be vetted and objected to in advance. The right to actually put the case is limited, and judges is authorised to control the wording that's used, and there are all manner of other restrictions that make the role of the defence advocate almost impossible in those cases. There's also the complex question of historic sex offending. And I'm not seeking to undermine the terribleness of sex offending, let me make it absolutely clear, but the criminal justice system has been influenced heavily by historic sex offending over the last 25 years or so. And when I say historic, I mean historic, 20, 30, 40 years. I myself had to sentence a man of 66 about a year ago, a headmaster in a school, for a sex offence committed 42 years before. A single offence, no other convictions, no other suggestion of any offending. The law in terms of offences is applied to the trial. In other words, the definition of offences and so on, but modern day sentencing guidelines, however historic the offence. And as a consequence of that, this 66-year-old man was sent to prison by me, reluctantly, 42 years later, for 3.5 years. Now, the jury had found him guilty, and I'm not condoning what he did, but I had great difficulty in sending this man, who was a different individual to the one who committed the offence decades before, to prison. And returning to the theme of the defence lawyer, that the role of the defence lawyer in that situation, both on a trial and in sentencing, is I would suggest incredibly important, because when a man such as that goes off to serve a prison sentence in his mid-60s, despite the efforts of the defence counsel to urge the judge to see things differently, many questions arise. What is he doing going to prison for an offence committed decades later? Should he go to prison for an offence committed so long afterwards? There are arguments both ways. What's he thinking when he gets there? He can't even remember what he did. He's had a decent life for 40 years since, and so on and so forth. There is, of course, the victim in the background who says, this has ruined my life and I'm never going to recover. So it's incredibly difficult, and hovering there is the defense lawyer. That's not defending the indefensible. That is playing an absolutely critical role in the administration of justice. And the same applies, I would suggest, returning to the theme of homicide cases, every single homicide case. I have never defended anybody in a homicide case who does not have a backstory of some kind. What I mean by that is that every single one of them sits in the dock following a lifetime of complications. Many emotional abuse, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, or a combination of all of them. And frequently I have found that that moment where that person brings the life of another to an end is an explosion of anger and frustration at what has been done to the defendant over his or her life. And where it's a her, this line of thinking applies in particular. And that, as I see it, is almost invariably the case. That does not mean that for one individual to kill another is not utterly reprehensible and should not be punished in the most extreme of ways. It just contextualizes the situation and once again presents the framework in which the concept of defending the indefensible is to be discussed. The defenses that arise in homicide cases are all totally valid and appropriate. Where there are street fights involving a number of individuals, as there often are in London, gang-based street fights, and someone or some people die, the culpability of the individuals concerned has to be individually adjudicated. Often that involves consideration of the defense of self-defense, issues of reasonable and proportionate force, questions of reaction on the spur of the moment, weighing up the circumstances. That is an inevitable feature of the criminal justice process. However strong the views of the public about, for example, knife crime, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, frequently, as occurred in a murder trial I was involved in earlier this year, where the whole incident blew up in a pub in the space of 55 seconds, frequently, the issue of self-defense arises, and juries have real difficulty in evaluating the application of it or not. The defense of loss of control, which involves a jury considering whether the defendant has lost control, why the defendant lost control, whether loss of control was an appropriate reaction. And I'm not dealing with the academic aspect in any detail, which brings culpability for murder down to manslaughter. There's a rigorous legislation framework on this, and loss of control, carefully regulated by law, which reduces culpability to manslaughter, is a perfectly proper and appropriate defense for a jury to consider, so much so that it's often left to the jury to consider, even where it's not the express defense raised by the defendant, because the obligation is for the judge to leave any appropriate defense. And we as defense lawyers who move on the territory of homicide are very often confronted with people who have personality disorders or more significant mental difficulties. And this, of course, is a very, very controversial area. I have defended so many people who have killed, who are sentenced to life imprisonment, who should not go to prison for a single day, because we actually don't know what else to do with them. And as Juliet Lyons, the director of Prison Reform Trust, said, it's difficult to think of anywhere more likely to make the mentally ill worse and drive someone to despair than the bleak, impersonal environment of an overcrowded prison. Now, that's why last year alone, there were 92 suicides and more than 20,000 attempts to self-harm in our prisons. And a former director of prisons, Anne Owers, has rightly said that prisoners become the default setting of those with mental and emotional disorders. The prominence of mental disorder in the commission of homicide is not to be understated. And the particular difficulty is that the horror of the crime, the emotive complexion of the crime, very often outweighs the truth behind why it was committed, and results in people being convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with huge minimum terms when they simply weren't well at the time the offence was committed. The defence of insanity is rarely run, and it's complicated, and quite often the individual was not insane. But the defence of diminished responsibility is far more common, which involves the defence assuming the burden of proof and establishing that the accused was suffering from an abnormality of mental functioning, from a recognised medical condition which substantially impaired his or her ability to understand their conduct and exercise rational judgment or self-control. For example, in the case of a 69-year-old man of good character, actually a very successful restaurateur in St Albans, who killed his father-in-law. I defended the 69-year-old man who was 87 by stabbing him 80 times. And the defense of diminished responsibility was established. If you met the defendant in the cold light of day, he was the most charming and mild-mannered man imaginable, but he'd been subjected to a lifetime of belittlement and humiliation by his father-in-law, which the jury accepted, which resulted in him falling into deep, profound depression and caused him to snap and stab his father-in-law all those times. And that depression was a psychiatric illness. And in that case, the jury acquitted him of murder and convicted him of manslaughter. He still received a sentence of 9 years imprisonment, and again, throwing up questions of the justice of the situation. So these are all complex matters that confront the courts and confront the defense. And before I move on, and I'm mindful of the time, and unless Steve indicates otherwise, perhaps I'll go on for about another 7 or 8 minutes. If that's okay, Steve.
Sorry, I just unmute. Yes, fine. You've got plenty of time.
Okay, maybe 10 minutes maximum, and then I'll stop.
That's great.
Right,
Thank you.
Very much. And one of the difficulties, which I just like to point out, is that in psychiatric cases, in homicide cases, juries are very often presented with contested psychiatric evidence. And how a jury is to come to terms with that, I do not know, because it can be very, very complex with all manner of difficult themes and theories. I'm a fervent supporter of the jury system. I don't support in any way the handing over of these matters to a judge, but it is just a feature of one of the difficulties that have to be grappled with. There is also, finally, in just talking about homicide cases, before I'll come finally just to look at questions of sentencing, this whole question of knife crime. We've got a terrible, terrible problem with knife crime in London. 27 people were killed in the first part of 2021 by reference to knife crime. There's been a 77% increase in homicide, knife crime homicides over recent years. Gun violence is bad, but knife problems are the greatest. But in terms of the trial process, the real issue that leads to so many young people being sent to prison for life is the principle of joint enterprise. We have a principle of joint enterprise, and I know there's one in Hong Kong, which was supposed to have been revolutionized, but hasn't been. The case of Joji, 2016, was supposed to be the revolutionary case, but resulted in secondary parties, that's not the principle, still being eligible for conviction for murder in circumstances where they don't do anything, but are said to have encouraged the principle with the appropriate intent for murder. So again, I'm not going to go into the sort of detail of the legislation because there simply isn't time, and without PowerPoint, it wouldn't be helpful. But I just want to stress that very often these cases, and we have so many of them, especially in London, 6 to 8 week trials, like the one that I told you about at the beginning, involve 8, 10 young individuals, generally black individuals from inner city estates, where one person commits the stabbing, but where on a joint enterprise basis, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are convicted of murder, all eligible for life imprisonment. In fact, all susceptible to the mandatory sentence of life imprisonment, if over 18, with a minimum starting point of 25 years imprisonment to be served, no, not half or 3/4, but 25 years. And if under 18, still receiving minimum terms in conjunction with a mandatory life sentence of 15, 17, 18 years. 13-year-old a couple of years ago, I represented 15, 16, 17 years ago. So we have to look at all of this, but the ultimate thing is, in the context of this presentation by me, that this is not defending the indefensible. I've defended so many 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are just bemused by how they are compelled to start a life sentence to the age of 17, 18. They have had no significant parenting. Their parental situation is dominated by single parent parenting. There is almost invariably no father figure and has never been any father figure. The mother is generally been on the receiving end of terrible domestic violence, an offence which I regard to be amongst the worst in the criminal panoply of all, and one that I particularly don't like being involved in myself. They offend in the background of the toxic environment of austerity, of governmental austerity, which leads to disaffection, fear and revenge, lack of trust in the authorities, poor policing, hostile policing, where individuals assume responsibility for law enforcement because they just don't trust the police, still a culture of institutional racism by the police in London, drifting into gangs, becoming involved in gangs, often not physically perpetrating any offence, but being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and being attributed the requisite mental element for murder in circumstances where the jury is confronted with very complex legal directions on a secondary party basis, difficulties in grappling with those directions as exhibited by the jury I told you about at the beginning, who've been out for 12 days, and our prisons, naturally, in those circumstances, are busting at the seams. So can I come finally, because I don't want to overdo my time, just to conclude by talking about sentencing, our role in sentencing and the position in relation to sentencing. We have a sentencing code, which is the Sentencing Code 2020, which received royal assent on the 22nd of October 2020 and streamlines 1,300 pages over multiple statutes of sentencing. I'm not sure whether Hong Kong has adopted the principle of sentencing guidelines, but we have rigorous sentencing guidelines, documented guidelines with categories relating to each offence, which specify aggravating and mitigating factors, and which provide a careful roadmap for the judge in relation to almost all offences. And our role, the role of the defence, is really important in studying, scrutinising, attacking those guidelines, and in persuading judges to pass the right sentence rather than to simply follow the guidelines in a robotic fashion. In homicide cases, of course, as everyone will know, we do not have the death penalty. It was abolished in the 1960s, and rightly so, in my view. And I saw it, as I've said so many times in murder mystery in my family, operating unjustly and not and in a cruel, barbaric, and unbelievable fashion in so many cases. Of course, the tragic and horrific and abominable killing of Sir David Amess last week, which I'm sure you'd have all heard about, the MP in Leigh-on-Sea, has triggered once again calls for the death penalty. But we don't have it, and I'm hoping personally that it will never ever rear its head in this country. What we do have here and across other parts of the world, including Hong Kong, is life imprisonment, and that in itself is controversial because there's a strict framework as to which level of homicide, and I'll focus on homicide, attracts what minimum term. We have the mandatory life sentence, and then minimum terms, whole life order, 30 years, 25 years, 15 years, whole life for the highest level of offending. Many of you will have heard about the police officer who killed Sarah Everard, pretending to be a police officer on duty. He was a serving police officer, raped and killed her, and received a whole life term, meaning he'll never come out, a couple of weeks ago. But the general ethos is we don't impose whole life sentences. There's a huge background to that, which again, I don't have time to go into. A burning issue is, should life mean life? But I've so often seen young offenders and mentally ill offenders sentenced to life with cruel minimum terms of 15, 18, 25, 35, 40 years. And I've discussed already my concerns about the appropriateness of those sentences. And all I would say is that I'm not suggesting for a moment that the indeterminate sentences ought not to be imposed in homicide cases. I'm highlighting that when it comes to sentence, once again, despite the tragedy of there having been a death, the principle of defending the indefensible rears its head once more, because for the judge to get the sentence right in terms of that minimum term in particular, is so important. The difference between an 18-year-old getting a minimum term of 15 years and 22 years or 25 years is so crucial in terms of any prospect of rehabilitation. And all kinds of arguments, of course, again arise at that stage as to the justice of the situation. So those are the areas I'm going to cover, and I hope they have been of interest. I just want to conclude once again by expressing my gratitude to Steve and CUHK for giving me this opportunity to talk about a topic which has been my work life for a few decades now, but which I feel as passionate about as ever before. The case that I began to tell you about, the one where the jury had been out for 2.5 weeks, I'm going to find out probably today what the verdict is in that case, and whether it be guilty or not guilty, or it could be that the jury won't be able to decide, and we'll have to have a retrial. I just know that my role in that, and that of my junior and other defence counsel, has been immovably indispensable. And it's not us who's making that decision today, it's the jury. And we have a jury system, and I will always support it. So anybody who ever asks me, and plenty of people do, in effect, you know, why do you waste your time doing that? I don't have the slightest hesitation in thinking back to the kind of situation that prevails in the case I've been telling you about today and many other. And I strongly believe that the role of the defense lawyer, far from falling into the category of defending the indispensable, is an indispensable role, as indispensable, as important as any in a free and open society. So those are my comments. Thank you for listening to me. And that brings what I have to say to an end.
About to be called away. I think that's all. Any questions for Jeremy on his comments there? I think we've got one coming on the chat feature there. I was just going to ask you one question, Jeremy, on the issues you said to do with the diminished responsibility. You mentioned this. Well, I think you were traveling, so I don't think you saw Yasmine's presentation.
No, unfortunately I didn't.
And she was talking about the Rurik Jutting case here, where the defendant had killed 2 women in Hong Kong, but the defense was based upon diminished responsibility, where they had 4 experts who said that he was suffering from an abnormality of the mind, 2 experts on the prosecution side who said, well, there may have been something, but it wasn't enough. And of course, in the end, that wasn't enough. He was convicted of murder, given the life sentence. You said, again, the thing that's been asked here, insanity is very rarely led as a defense. Is that just because it's not going to be accepted? Because I mean, are there any cases you've been involved in where it's ever been led and it's been accepted? Defense of insanity?
Those are very good questions, Steve, because I often wonder myself why insanity is not more prevalent. I mean, I think the answer is yes. It's rarely accepted. It requires the defense to have 2 experts to establish insanity. It's almost impossible to get 2 experts to say that someone was insane. So the culture just is to kind of bypass insanity and stick with diminished responsibility. I'm aware of the Jutting case. I'm sorry I couldn't listen to the presentation. But yeah, it's just, it's kind of almost as if, you know, the criminal justice system regards insanity as a historic, archaic concept that kind of no longer applies, and everybody just moves in the direction of diminished responsibility. I think I ran insanity about 20 years ago. I can't actually remember what the outcome was. All I do remember is that I was at court on Christmas Eve till about 11 p.m. waiting for a jury's verdict. I can't actually remember what the verdict was. I know that's not an impressive contribution, but just comes to mind.
It's good to bring that in. But then on that diminished responsibility, then you mentioned you had success with that, well, at least the jury provided to the correct verdict there. But do you think that's a very successful defense? Does it come out very much?
Well, diminished responsibility. The thing is that when people are charged with murder, you know, the range of defenses are limited. So the starting point is to look for a defense. I mean, obviously, you're not going to have diminished responsibility in knife crime cases, but in many other types of murder cases, domestic abuse, where women and some men have been domestically abused, sometimes partners, sometimes parents, people who are drug motivated and so on. The diminished responsibility is often identified as a possible defense. The answer is that diminished responsibility is run frequently, yes, as a defense. I would say in a significant number of cases. It's not uncommon for juries to acquit of murder and convict of manslaughter based on diminished responsibility. The concern I have, as I've said, and I'm not promoting any other system, but it's still an anxiety of mine, is that I often feel that juries don't really understand the expert evidence because it's just so complicated. It takes us weeks to get it up and try and understand it, and they just hear the experts once and are expected to absorb all the detail and work it out, grasp the concepts, and choose which expert evidence they want. So yes, it's run, yes, it's sometimes successful, but I do think there are frequent injustices because it's just too complex a defense to grapple with.
Great, thank you very much. Well, Yasmine's nodding her head along with you with everything you said there.
Oh, that's excellent. I'm pleased to hear that.
I think she's seen similar things in Hong Kong as well.
Right, well, that's very interesting, and I'm fortified by that.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I think we're out of time now, so I think all it remains me to do is to thank you very much, Jeremy, for joining us today and giving up your time. To congratulate you on another great win in Europe last night. I think unbeaten in Europe, I believe. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. I'm very proud of it too.
That's yes.
And we won't discuss your team. And I'm sure the delegates don't really want to hear about Chelsea.
No one wants to hear about Chelsea. There we go. Doing not too badly. But anyway, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you also to our other speakers. Thank you to Ian Morley and to Yasmine Zahir, of course. As I said, when I originally was talking to Ian about this conference, this was, I think, exactly what we were thinking of, some event like this. And it's been great to have the speakers today joining us in this very interesting conference. Thank you to all the people who came to join us in the moot court at CUHK Law, because they got the chance, of course, to see Ian's interesting exhibits of the original copies of the Police Illustrated Gazette from 1888 as well. So thank you for all joining us here. And thank you for everyone who joined us online. I don't think I've actually got any events to promote. I've got events to promote. Sorry, I should quickly promote upcoming events. So next Friday, very much linked into the subjects we've been talking about today, we've got Dr. Chris Mun from HKU, who will be talking about magistracies in colonial Hong Kong. This is the latest in our Greater China Legal History seminar series. It's 12:30 till 2 o'clock. So it's a bit early in the day, I think, for you and Jeremy in London. But for everyone else, please come along. You can sign up for this. It's an online only event. And Chris Mun, I think, has got a new book out on this subject as well. So I believe that if you do sign up for this event, you can also get a discount on his book as well. There's some special offer linked into attendance at the event. So please come and join us for the latest in the Greater China Legal History seminar series. And then after that, I think Ellen's just helping, moving on to the next. Yes, the next is we have a talk on Thomas Spence and Common Property, a political plan against poverty and empire. So that's coming up on the 28th of October on the Thursday. So again, please feel free to sign up for that. The details will be on the website. And then the final event is the latest in our landmark series, Female Legal Leaders, which is on the 18th of November. So we're giving you nice advance notice of this. I'm not sure, is that going to actually be an in-person face-to-face event? I'm looking over to the Dean to see. The Dean doesn't actually know. So it's always good when you hear that the Dean doesn't know about these things as well. But I get the feeling this is being held at the I know it's going to be held at the Graduate Law Centre. So it may be that we have some limited spaces available for that face-to-face. So please feel free to sign up online. It may be that there may be some limited spaces available face-to-face because we are trying to organise some of our events for that as well. So again, thank you very much. Are there any other events, Ellen, that we need to share? So I think that's the last in our events we need to share. Once again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to everyone for joining us. And please come and join us again at our future events. All that remains to be said after that is we are CUHK Law. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.